Welcome to Bleak Fears. November in the Appalachian Mountains brings more than just falling leaves and cold winds. It brings encounters that defy explanation. Tonight, I'm sharing 11 true stories from people who experienced the unexplainable in these ancient hills. For privacy, names and minor details have been changed, but I can assure you these accounts are completely authentic and verified. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it? If you're ready for genuinely disturbing encounters, hit that like button, subscribe, and let's begin. You might want to keep the lights on for this one. My name is Pedro, and I'm a telecommunications tower technician. I've been climbing towers for 12 years now, working mostly across West Virginia, maintaining the equipment that keeps your cell phones and radios working. November 2017 changed everything. I thought I understood about my job, about technology, and honestly, about reality itself. What happened on that tower outside Helvetia still makes me question whether I'm living in the timeline I'm supposed to be in. It was November 19th, 2017, a Tuesday morning around 6 a.m. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and a thick fog had settled over the mountains like a gray blanket. I'd been assigned a routine maintenance check on a radio tower about 15 miles outside Helvetia, one of those isolated spots where you might see more deer than people in a week. The tower stood 280 feet tall, a lattice structure that had been there since the 80s. My job was simple: climb up, check the broadcasting equipment, replace some aging cables, and climb back down. Should have taken 3 hours, maybe 4 with the fog slowing me down. I had Sergio with me that day, my ground crew. He was newer to the company, only been working with us for about 8 months, but he was reliable and knew the safety protocols. We arrived at the site just as the fog started glowing with that early morning light that never quite breaks through. The tower rose up into the gray like it was reaching into another dimension. I remember the smell, damp earth, pine needles, and that metallic scent that always hangs around these old towers. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, probably around 38 degrees. "Looks like soup up there," Sergio said, checking his radio. "You sure you don't want to wait for this to clear?" I shook my head, already stepping into my climbing harness. "Company wants this done today. I've climbed in worse." That was true, but something felt off that morning. The fog seemed thicker than it should be, almost solid, and the usual sounds of the forest, birds, wind through the trees, were completely absent. Just silence and that metallic smell getting stronger. I started my climb at 6:23 a.m. exactly. I know because I logged it on my phone before clipping onto the tower's safety cable. The steel was ice cold even through my gloves, and moisture from the fog coated every surface. Every 20 feet or so, I'd stop and call down to Sergio on the radio. Standard procedure. 50 feet, I'd say, and he'd respond, "Copy that, 50 feet. The routine of it was comforting in that unnatural quiet. By the time I reached 150 feet, I was completely inside the fog. Couldn't see the ground anymore, couldn't see the top of the tower either. Just gray, nothing in every direction, and the steel ladder in front of my face. That's when I noticed my radio making a weird sound. Not static exactly, but a low humming that pulsed at irregular intervals. I pressed the transmit button. "Sergio, you copy? My radio's acting strange." Nothing. Just that pulsing hum. "Sergio, do you read me?" The hum got louder, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. My own voice, crystal clear, saying, "Don't trust the equipment on level 7. But I hadn't said that. My mouth hadn't moved. I pressed the transmit button again, hands shaking now despite the cold. "Sergio, if you can hear me, I'm getting interference. Something's wrong with the equipment." His voice crackled through, broken and distant. "Pedro. Can't. Clearly static. You there?" The temperature dropped suddenly, noticeably. I could see frost forming on the metal in front of my eyes, spreading in geometric patterns that looked almost deliberate. I kept climbing because going down in that fog seemed more dangerous than going up. At least at the top, I'd be at the equipment platform where I could assess the situation. I reached level 7, the main equipment platform, at what should have been around 7 a.m. But when I checked my phone, it showed 6:15 a.m., 8 minutes before I'd started climbing. That couldn't be right. I'd been on this tower for over an hour. I tapped the screen, thinking it had frozen, but it was working fine. The time just didn't make sense. That's when I saw it. Mounted on the platform, attached to the main broadcasting array with professional-grade cables, was a piece of equipment I'd never seen before. It was about the size of a car battery, metallic, and covered in ports and switches, with a small digital display that showed numbers constantly changing. This wasn't supposed to be here. I maintain this tower. I know every piece of equipment on it, and this wasn't in any maintenance log. I got closer, careful not to touch it. And that's when the smell hit me. Ozone and burned plastic and something else. Something organic and wrong. The device was warm, almost hot, which made no sense in this freezing fog. The digital display cycled through what looked like dates and times, but they were all wrong. November 23rd, 2017. November 19th, 2018. November 19th, 2019. Dates that hadn't happened yet, and dates that should have been happening right now. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, and my radio crackled in response. But it wasn't Sergio's voice. It was mine again, saying, "You installed it. 3 years from now. You'll understand when it's time." The voice had my inflection, my slight accent, everything, but I wasn't speaking. I tried the radio again. "Sergio, we have unauthorized equipment up here. Are you seeing anything unusual on your instruments?" Static. Then his voice, clearer now. "Pedro, I lost you for a second there. You said something about level 5. No, I'm on level 7. There's equipment here that shouldn't be. Pedro, you're breaking up. I'm just getting static. Can you... Your position?" The device beeped, and the display locked onto a single date. November 19th, 2017, 7:43 a.m. That was over an hour from now, according to my phone's wrong time. Or maybe 20 minutes from now, if time was actually working properly. My head was starting to hurt, a sharp pain right behind my eyes like pressure building. I made a decision. This thing wasn't supposed to be here, and it was clearly causing problems. I started documenting it with my phone camera, taking pictures from every angle, zooming in on the display, the cable connections, everything. Then I found the main power cable and followed it to where it connected to the tower's electrical system. Whoever installed this knew what they were doing. It was professional work, clean connections, weatherproofed properly. As I reached for my wire cutters, the fog around me started to move. Not blow away, move. It swirled in patterns, and in those patterns, I started seeing things. Shapes that looked almost like people, like versions of me climbing this same tower. I saw myself younger, wearing different gear. I saw myself older, gray in my beard, reaching for this same device. I saw myself standing exactly where I was standing, reaching for the same wire cutters, over and over in infinite variations. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the cutters. The pain behind my eyes was intense now, and I could taste copper in my mouth, that metallic tang that comes before you throw up. But I cut the cable anyway. The device powered down with a descending whine, and the display went dark. The fog vanished instantly. Not gradually, just gone. 1 second I was surrounded by gray nothing. The next I could see for miles in every direction. Clear November sky, sun already high, the forest below looking normal and alive. I could hear birds again, wind in the trees, the normal sounds of the world. Pedro, are you okay up there?" Sergio's voice came through crystal clear on the radio. "You just appeared. 1 second I couldn't see anything above 100 feet. Next second the fog's gone and you're up there." I'm okay. I'm coming down. Did you see anyone else approach the tower? Any vehicles?" "No, man, it's been just us. You've been up there for like 10 minutes. Why?" 10 minutes. I'd been up here for over an hour, cutting cables and taking pictures and losing my mind in impossible fog. I looked at my phone. 7:32 a.m. The pictures I'd taken were still there. The device was still mounted on the platform, cables I'd cut still dangling, cut ends visible. I climbed down faster than I should have. Safety be damned. My legs were shaking and my head was pounding, and I needed to be on solid ground. Sergio met me at the bottom, looking concerned. "Dude, you look like you've seen a ghost. What happened up there?" I showed him the pictures. "There's equipment on level 7 that's not in our maintenance logs. Professional installation connected to the main power supply." He scrolled through the images, frowning. "That's weird. Should I call it in to the regional office?" Yeah, definitely. And I need to file a full report about the fog and the radio interference." We packed up the gear, and I sat in the truck while Sergio made calls. I was staring at my phone, at those pictures, when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the reflection on the device's metal casing visible in one of the close-up shots, I could see my hand. I was wearing my wedding ring on my right hand. I've always worn it on my left. I am right now, as I'm telling you this story. But in that picture, clear as day, it's on my right hand. The regional office sent a team out 3 days later. They removed the device and told me it would be analyzed. I never heard back about their findings despite multiple follow-up calls. My supervisor told me to drop it, that these things happen with old towers sometimes. Unauthorized equipment gets installed and removed, and it's above my pay grade. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. 2 weeks after the incident, I was going through some old paperwork in my garage, looking for my original tower certification documents for a license renewal. I found a maintenance log from that same tower, dated November 2020. 3 years in the future from when the incident happened. The handwriting was mine. The signature was mine. And in the log, dated November 19th, 2020, there was an entry: installed frequency modulation device on level 7 platform. Authorization code TK443. Required for temporal calibration testing. I don't know what that means. I don't know if I wrote it, or will write it, or if I'm somehow caught in something I can't understand. I still climb towers. I still do my job. But every time I'm on that particular tower outside Helvetia, I check level 7. The device hasn't reappeared. The cables I cut are still dangling there, cut ends exactly as I left them. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick like it did that day, I swear I can hear that pulsing hum on my radio. And sometimes I hear my own voice, saying things I haven't said yet, giving me warnings about dates that haven't arrived. I've started keeping detailed logs of everything: dates, times, weather conditions, every word I hear on that radio. Maybe someday it'll make sense. Maybe someday I'll understand what I'm supposed to do with that device, or why I apparently installed it 3 years after I cut its power. Or maybe I already understand, and I just haven't remembered yet. Time is supposed to move in one direction, but up on that tower, surrounded by that impossible fog, I'm not sure that rule applies anymore. All I know is I keep climbing, keep maintaining, and keep waiting for November 19th, 2020 to arrive. Because according to that log, that's when I'm supposed to install the very thing I destroyed. And I have no idea if I'll actually do it, or if I already have, or if the version of me who wrote that log is even the same person telling you this story right now. The Appalachian Mountains are old. The rocks here are some of the oldest on Earth. Maybe time works differently in places that ancient. Maybe that tower standing there for decades broadcasting signals into the air picked up something it wasn't supposed to. Or maybe I did. All I can tell you is that my wedding ring is on my left hand, where it's always been, but in that photograph, it's on my right, and I don't know which version of me is real anymore. My name is Eliana, and I'm 67 years old now, though I was much younger when I first saw them. I spent 35 years teaching elementary school in Atlanta before I retired and moved to my family's old property in Cloudland, Georgia, right on the edge of the Appalachian Mountains. The house had been in my family since the 1950s, sitting on 40 acres of wooded land that backs up against thousands of acres of national forest. I moved there in November 1994, looking forward to quiet retirement, gardening, and maybe finally writing that book I'd always talked about. I got the quiet, but I also got something else, something that still happens every year, like clockwork, and I've stopped trying to understand it. I just witness it now. The first time I saw the procession was November 23, 1994. I'd only been living in the house for 2 weeks, still unpacking boxes and getting used to the isolation. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the mountain, and the nearest town with a real grocery store was 15 miles of winding roads away. I loved it, honestly. After decades of classroom noise and Atlanta traffic, the silence of those woods felt like medicine. The house sat on a hill, and my back porch looked out over a gentle slope that led down to thick forest. Old-growth trees, the kind that have been there for centuries, with trunks so wide 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. That evening, I was on the back porch, around 5:30, just as the sun was starting to set. November sun in the mountains has this particular quality, golden and slanted, making everything look like an oil painting. The temperature was dropping fast, probably down to the low 40s, and I had a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and a cup of tea going cold in my hands. I was just sitting there, watching the light change through the trees, when I saw movement at the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was deer. We had plenty of them on the property, but the movement was wrong for deer, too upright, too deliberate. Then they emerged from the tree line, and my teacup nearly fell from my hands. Children. A line of children walking in single file through my backwoods, heading deeper into the forest. I counted 12 of them, all appearing to be between the ages of maybe 6 and 12 years old. They wore strange clothing, old-fashioned, like something from a historical photograph. The girls had long dresses that reached their ankles, dark colors mostly, with white aprons. The boys wore dark pants held up with suspenders, white shirts with the sleeves rolled up despite the cold. Every single child carried something, a carved wooden doll held carefully in both hands like it was precious. The dolls were crude, the kind you might make yourself with basic woodworking tools, but even from a distance I could see they'd been crafted with care. Each child walked with their head slightly bowed, looking down at the doll they carried, moving in. Perfect, silent synchronization. No talking, no laughing, none of the noise you'd expect from a group of children. Just silent, purposeful walking. I stood up, my blanket falling to the porch floor. "Hey," I called out. "Are you kids okay? Are you lost?" My voice echoed through the quiet woods, but not one child turned their head. They just kept walking, that same steady pace, disappearing between the trees. I could see them for maybe another 30 seconds, white shirts and aprons flickering between the dark tree trunks, and then they were gone. My first thought was that some kind of historical reenactment group was using the forest, maybe filming something. But there were no adults with them, no camera crews, no vehicles parked anywhere near my property, and it was getting dark. What kind of parents would let their children walk through the woods at dusk, dressed in thin, old-fashioned clothes in November? I went inside and called the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher was polite but seemed unconcerned. Said they'd send someone to check it out, but it was probably just local kids taking a shortcut through the woods. She asked if I was the new resident up on Cloudland Road, and when I said yes, she told me welcome to the area and not to worry too much. Kids around here knew those woods better than most adults. But something about it bothered me all night. The silence of them, the identical dolls, the way they moved like they were in a trance. I couldn't sleep, kept getting up and looking out my back windows at the dark forest, half expecting to see them walking back. A deputy came by the next morning, a young man who looked fresh out of the academy. He walked the tree line, looked at the ground, and came back shaking his head. No footprints, no signs of any children. The ground was soft enough that there should have been tracks, he said. Maybe I'd seen shadows, the way the sunset can play tricks in the woods. I didn't argue with him, but I knew what I'd seen. I spent the next few days asking around town carefully, not wanting to sound like the crazy new lady from Atlanta. Nobody knew anything about children walking through the woods. No historical groups, no school projects, nothing. One elderly woman at the general store gave me an odd look when I described what I'd seen and told me some areas of these mountains had their own ways, their own business, and sometimes it was best to just let things be. I tried to let it be. I really did. But I couldn't stop thinking about those children, about where they were going with such purpose. So exactly 1 week after I first saw them, I decided I'd follow their path. It was afternoon, plenty of daylight left, and I'm not a fragile woman. I've hiked plenty in my life. I put on sturdy boots, took a flashlight and my phone, though there was no cell signal up there, and walked down to where I'd seen them enter the forest. I found their path almost immediately. Not a trail exactly, but a route through. The trees where the undergrowth seemed slightly less dense, where you could walk without too much difficulty. I followed it, marking trees with bright orange surveyor's tape as I went so I could find my way back. The forest got darker quickly, those old trees blocking out most of the sky. I could smell damp earth, rotting leaves, and that particular scent of old wood and moss. Every so often, I'd hear sounds, birds, something small rustling in the undergrowth, the distant sound of water running over rocks. I walked for maybe 40 minutes, checking my watch periodically. The path seemed to follow a natural depression in the land, a small valley between two ridges. Then I saw it, the mouth of a cave, maybe 8 feet high and 12 feet wide, set into the side of a rocky hillside. The opening was partially hidden by overhanging roots and vegetation, but the path led directly to it. The ground in front of the cave was smooth stone, worn down by what must have been centuries of foot traffic. I stood at the entrance, my flashlight beam cutting into the darkness. The cave went back at least 30 feet from what I could see, and the walls were limestone, pale and slightly damp. I could hear water dripping somewhere deeper inside. My teacher's instinct was screaming at me that this was dangerous, that I should go back and report this to authorities. The children shouldn't be anywhere near an unmarked cave. But something else, something deeper, told me to go inside. The temperature dropped the moment I stepped into the cave. My breath came out in visible clouds, even though it hadn't been that cold outside. The walls were covered in marks, scratches, symbols, things that might have been writing in a language I didn't recognize. Some looked old, worn down by time and moisture. Others looked newer, sharper. My flashlight beam found something on the cave floor about 15 feet in, and I moved closer, my heart pounding. Dolls. Dozens of wooden dolls, arranged in a perfect circle on the stone floor. They were just like the ones the children had been carrying, hand-carved, simple, but crafted with obvious care. Some looked ancient, the wood dark and cracked with age. Others looked newer, the wood still pale. They were all facing inward, toward the center of the circle where there was a natural depression in the stone floor that held water, like a small pool. I knelt down, not touching anything, just looking. The water in the depression was perfectly clear and still, like a mirror. In my flashlight beam, I could see something at the bottom. Carved into the stone beneath the water were more symbols, and what looked like names. I couldn't read most of them. Time and water had worn them down, but a few were still legible. Sarah, born 1891, James, born 1894, Elizabeth, born 1889. A dozen names, maybe more, all with birth years in the late 1800s. No death dates, just birth years. I took photos with my camera, the flash harsh and wrong feeling in that sacred space. Because that's what it was. I could feel it. This was a sacred place, or had been. Something important had happened here. As I was backing away, my flashlight caught something on the wall near the entrance. More names, carved more recently. These had full dates. The Children of Cloudland Hollow, November 23, 1897. Gone to the sacred place. Taken by the mountain. I left quickly after that, following my orange tape markers back to my property. The sun was setting when I emerged from the woods, and I stood on my porch, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what I'd found. A historical tragedy, clearly. Children from some isolated community probably died in that cave or near it back in 1897. Some kind of ritual or religious practice that went wrong. That was the rational explanation. But that didn't explain why I'd seen them, dressed in 1890s clothing, walking through my woods in 1994. I went to the County Historical Society the next day. They had records, sparse ones, of a small community called Cloudland Hollow that had existed in the area in the late 1800s. Very isolated, religious, possibly some kind of separatist group. In November 1897, all 12 children in the community disappeared. Vanished overnight. Massive search at the time, but no bodies were ever found. No evidence of what happened. The community scattered after that, abandoned the area. The records listed the children's names. Every one of them matched the names I'd seen carved at the bottom of that water pool. I should have stopped there, should have accepted it as a tragic historical mystery and moved on with my retirement. But November 23, 1995, came around, and at 5:30 p.m., just as the sun was setting, they walked through my woods again. The same 12 children, the same old-fashioned clothes, the same wooden dolls, the same silent procession heading into the forest. I watched from my porch, and this time I didn't call out. I just watched them disappear into the trees. I followed them. I kept my distance, staying maybe 50 yards back, moving quietly. They walked the same path I'd found, straight to the cave. At the entrance, they stopped. Each child placed their doll on the ground, arranging them in that same circle I'd seen. Then, one by one, they stepped into the cave. I crept closer, my heart hammering, and watched as they gathered around that pool of water. They knelt down, all 12 of them, and placed their hands on the stone floor. They bowed their heads, and then they were gone. Not walked deeper into the cave, gone, vanished. One moment they were kneeling there, and the next moment the cave was empty except for the dolls and the sound of dripping water. I stood there for 5 full minutes, shining my flashlight into every corner, but there was no one there, just the dolls in their circle and the pool with its carved names. I walked back to my house in darkness, using my flashlight to follow my old orange tape. When I checked the cave, the next day the dolls were gone too. The stone floor was bare, except for that pool of water, and the names carved beneath its surface. It's November 2024 now, 30 years since I first saw them. I'm 97 years old, still living in that same house, though I need a cane now and my daughter wants me to move to assisted living in Atlanta. But I can't leave, not yet. Because every year on November 23rd at 5:30 p.m. as the sun is setting, those 12 children walk through my woods. The same children, the same age they were in 1897, carrying their wooden dolls in the same silent procession. I watch them from my porch every year. I don't follow them anymore. My old bones couldn't make that walk now anyway. But I watch. Sometimes I wonder if they know I'm here. If they see me, an old woman wrapped in blankets on her porch, bearing witness to their eternal walk to whatever sacred place they're seeking. I wonder if they disappeared on purpose. If this was some ritual that went right instead of wrong. If they're not trapped but choosing this path every year for reasons I'll never understand. The mountains are old here, older than human memory, and maybe there are doors in these woods that open once a year, passages to places we're not meant to follow. I stopped trying to explain it decades ago. I stopped telling people about it after the first few years when I learned that talking about it just made people worried about my mental health. Now I just mark it on my calendar every year. November 23rd, the day the children walk. I make sure I'm on my porch at 5:30 watching, bearing witness, because someone should. Someone should remember that 12 children from Cloudland Hollow walked into these mountains in 1897 and never came back, except for one day each year when they returned to walk their path again. The dolls change, I've noticed over the years. Each November 23rd, when they appear, the dolls they carry look slightly different, more worn, or sometimes newer, as if time is touching them even if it's not touching the children. I don't know what that means. I don't know what any of it means, but I'll keep watching every year until I can't anymore. And I've left instructions with my daughter that when I'm gone, whoever owns this property next should be told to watch the woods on November 23rd at sunset. Just watch. Don't interfere. Don't follow. Just watch. And remember that some things in these mountains are older and stranger than we can understand. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're just meant to be witnessed, year after year, as the children walk their eternal path through the woods, going wherever it is they need to go. My name is Kyle, and I'm 29 years old. I run a YouTube channel focused on urban exploration, mostly abandoned buildings and forgotten places across the Appalachian region. I've explored old factories, closed down schools, abandoned amusement parks, all kinds of locations that most people would never think twice about. I've encountered squatters, unstable floors, asbestos, all the usual hazards, but nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened in Lynch, Kentucky, in November 2021. What happened in that abandoned hospital changed everything I thought I understood about reality, about my own body, and about what's possible in places that have been left to rot. Lynch is a former coal town in Harlan County, right in the heart of the mountains. The place boomed in the early 1900s when U.S. Coal and Coke Corporation built mines there, and it died slowly after the mines closed. By 2021, most of the town was abandoned or barely hanging on. The hospital I'd heard about had been closed since 1987, a 3-story brick building that used to serve the coal company employees and their families. It sat on a hill overlooking what was left of the town, windows broken, covered in graffiti, the kind of place that urban explorers dream about. I went there on November 12, 2021, a Friday. I had my usual gear, 2 cameras, 1 handheld, and 1 mounted on my chest for continuous footage, extra batteries, flashlights, a respirator mask because old hospitals are full of mold and asbestos, and my phone for emergencies, though cell service up there was sketchy at best. I arrived around 2 p.m., parked my car on the road below the hospital, and hiked up the overgrown driveway. The afternoon sun was bright but cold, temperature maybe in the mid-40s, and I could smell that particular scent of decay that abandoned buildings have: rotting wood, mildew, standing water, and something organic and wrong underneath it all. The main entrance was boarded up, but like most abandoned places, someone had already broken in and left an easy access point. I squeezed through a broken window on the first floor, careful of the glass, and found myself in what had been a waiting room. Chairs were overturned, old magazines from the 80s scattered across the floor, water-stained ceiling tiles hanging down, standard abandoned hospital stuff. I turned on both cameras and started documenting, narrating as I went, explaining the history of the building for my viewers. The first floor was what I expected: administrative offices, a pharmacy that had been completely stripped, a cafeteria with ancient appliances still in place, everything covered in layers of dust and mold, graffiti on most walls, evidence of homeless people having stayed there at various times, empty bottles, old sleeping bags, the usual signs. I spent about 40 minutes on the first floor getting good footage, checking structural stability as I went. The building seemed solid enough despite its age. The second floor was patient rooms, long corridors with doors hanging open, revealing empty rooms with rusted bed frames and tattered curtains. The smell was worse up here, that hospital smell mixing with decay. I could taste it even through my respirator, a sweetness that made my stomach uneasy, The light coming through the broken windows cast strange shadows, and my footsteps echoed on the old linoleum floors. I was getting great footage, exactly the kind of atmospheric content my viewers loved. Then I reached the third floor, and that's where everything changed. The stairwell leading up was darker than the others, and I noticed the smell changed too. Less mildew, more chemical, like antiseptic, and something metallic. The door at the top of the stairs was closed, which was unusual. Most doors in abandoned buildings are open or missing entirely. This one was closed and looked almost maintained. No rust on the hinges, no significant damage. I pushed it open and stepped into a corridor that made my skin crawl immediately. It was too clean. Not pristine, but cleaner than it should have been after 30-plus years of abandonment. There was dust, but not the thick layers I'd seen on the other floors. The walls weren't as covered in graffiti. The fluorescent light fixtures still hung properly from the ceiling, some of them still containing intact bulbs. At the end of the corridor, I could see a set of double doors with faded lettering that read "Surgical Wing." Every instinct told me to turn around, but I'm not proud to admit that my desire for unique content won out. I walked down that corridor, my camera recording everything, my chest camera capturing my increasingly nervous breathing through the respirator. The surgical wing doors were unlocked. I pushed them open and walked into what had clearly been the main operating room. And that's when my brain tried to reject what my eyes were seeing. The room was set up, not abandoned, not destroyed, set up. There was an operating table in the center, metal and padded, with leather restraints hanging from its sides. Surgical instruments were laid out on a tray beside it, scalpels and forceps, and things I couldn't identify, all of them gleaming like they'd been cleaned recently. An overhead surgical light hung above the table, and though there was no power in the building, I could swear it looked ready to function. The floor was clean, recently mopped from the look of it. There were no cobwebs, no dust on those instruments, no rust. I stood there filming, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Someone must be using this space for something. Some squatter with a weird obsession with medical equipment, or maybe some kind of illegal operation. But the equipment looked vintage, from the 80s, the same era the hospital closed, and it was organized with professional precision, not the chaotic setup of someone playing around. That's when the pain hit. A sharp burning sensation in my lower right, abdomen, like someone had pressed a hot knife against my skin from the inside. I gasped, doubling over, my camera dropping to hang from its strap around my neck. The pain was intense, focused in one specific spot, and I could feel warmth spreading across my skin. I lifted my shirt with shaking hands and saw something that made me forget about the camera, forget about content, forget about everything except pure terror. There was an incision on my abdomen, fresh. A clean surgical cut about 4 inches long, held together with what looked like dissolvable sutures, the kind that doctors use for internal wounds. The skin around it was red and inflamed, but the cut itself was precise, professional. Blood was seeping through, not a lot, but enough to stain my shirt. I hadn't felt anything before that moment. No pain during my exploration, no sensation of being cut, nothing. But now I could see it and feel it, and it was real. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Had I cut myself on something without noticing? But that didn't explain the sutures, the professional-looking incision. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands, trying to get cell service, trying to call for help. No signal. Of course, there was no signal. I needed to get out of this building, get to my car, drive somewhere with service, get to a hospital. But my legs wouldn't cooperate properly. I felt weak, dizzy, like I'd lost more blood than the small amount I could see. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself, and that's when I noticed my chest camera was still recording. I looked down at the screen, scrolling back through the last few minutes of footage while I'd been in the operating room. What I saw made my blood run cold. The footage showed me entering the room, walking around the operating table, examining the instruments. But it also showed something else. Shadowy figures, visible only on camera, not to my naked eye when I'd been in the room. 3 figures in surgical gowns and masks moving around me as I filmed. One of them had gestured to the operating table. Another had reached out toward my abdomen. The footage was grainy, the figures translucent and dark, but they were there. They'd been there with me in that room, and then the footage showed me lying on that operating table. I had no memory of this, none. But there I was, on camera, lying still while those shadow figures moved around me with instruments. One of them made a cutting motion. The timestamp showed this had happened at 4:23 p.m., about 7 minutes ago. 7 minutes I'd completely lost. 7 minutes I had no memory of experiencing. I had to get out. I pushed away from the wall and ran, or tried to. My legs were weak, and the pain in my abdomen was getting worse with every movement. I made it down the stairs, using the railings to support myself, my cameras banging against my chest, my breathing harsh and panicked inside the respirator. Blood was soaking through my shirt now, spreading in a warm wet patch that I could feel against my skin. I got to the first floor and stumbled toward the window I'd entered through. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows through the broken windows. I could smell that antiseptic smell following me, growing stronger, and I could hear something behind me. Footsteps, multiple sets, echoing in the empty corridors. I didn't look back. I squeezed through the window, scraping my arms on the broken glass, not caring, just needing to be outside. The fresh air hit me like a physical thing. I ripped off the respirator and ran down the overgrown driveway toward my car, my hand pressed against my abdomen trying to slow the bleeding. I fumbled with my keys, got the door open, collapsed into the driver's seat. My phone showed 1 bar of service. I called 911, my voice shaking as I tried to explain that I needed an ambulance, that I'd been injured, giving them my location as best I could. The operator kept me on the line while help was dispatched. She asked what happened, and I couldn't explain it. I told her I'd been cut, that I needed medical attention. She asked who cut me, and I had no answer. 20 minutes later, an ambulance arrived, and 2 EMTs helped me into the back. One of them, a woman named Summer, looked at my wound, and her expression changed from professional concern to confusion. "This is a surgical incision," she said. "These are absorbable sutures. Who did this? When?" "I don't know," I told her, and it was the truth. I was exploring the old hospital, and then I had this pain, and it was there. Summer and her partner exchanged looks. They stabilized me, started an IV, put pressure on the wound to slow the bleeding. The drive to the nearest functioning hospital took 40 minutes, and during that time, Summer kept asking me questions I couldn't answer. Who performed the surgery? Why? When? I had no answers, just my camera footage and a wound that shouldn't exist. At the hospital in Harlan, they took me into emergency surgery. The cut had gone deep, through skin and muscle, and when the surgeon came to talk to me afterward, his face was pale. He told me the incision had been made with professional precision, that whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. But more disturbing, he said they'd found something during the surgery. Foreign tissue, he called it. A small amount of organic matter that wasn't mine, stitched into the muscle layer. They'd removed it and sent it for analysis. "What kind of tissue?" I asked. He hesitated. "We're not entirely sure. It doesn't match any standard human tissue markers we tested for. It's being sent to a specialized lab." I stayed in the hospital for 3 days. During that time, I reviewed all my camera footage, both the handheld and chest-mounted cameras. The chest camera clearly showed those shadow figures and showed me on that operating table for those 7 missing minutes. The handheld camera, which I dropped when the pain hit, showed nothing unusual, just empty rooms and hallways. Only the chest camera, which had been recording continuously, captured what really happened. The tissue analysis came back inconclusive. The lab report said the sample contained human cellular structure, but with anomalies they couldn't explain. DNA testing showed it was partially my own DNA, but also something else, something that didn't match any known genetic markers in their database. The doctor who showed me the report looked uncomfortable and suggested I might want to seek a second opinion from a research hospital. I went home to recover, and that's when other urban explorers started contacting me. 3 different people, all of whom had explored that same hospital in Lynch within the past 2 years. All of them reported similar experiences: unexplained incisions, missing time, surgical precision wounds that appeared without any memory of how they happened. One of them had the same tissue analysis results: foreign organic matter mixed with their own. None of us could explain it. None of us had any memory of the actual procedures. I reported everything to the police, showed them my footage, gave them medical records. They investigated the hospital, and their report said the building was empty, abandoned, no evidence of any recent activity. The operating room I'd filmed was dusty and empty, they said. No instruments, no clean floors, just decades of decay like the rest of the building. When I insisted on going back with them, bringing my footage to compare, they refused, said the building was too structurally unsound and they couldn't allow civilians inside. 2 weeks after my experience, the hospital burned down, a massive fire that local news attributed to vandals. The building was completely destroyed, nothing left but a burned-out shell and a pile of rubble. The fire marshal's report said accelerants were used, that it was definitely arson, but they never found who did it. I tried to investigate, drove back to Lynch, but the site had been cleared, the rubble removed, and a chain-link fence erected around the property with no trespassing signs everywhere. The incision healed, leaving a scar that I still have. It's neat and clean, exactly what you'd expect from professional surgery. Sometimes it aches, particularly at night, and when it does, I find myself thinking about those shadow figures on my camera footage. I think about those 7 missing minutes. I think about the tissue they put inside me, that foreign matter that the lab couldn't identify. I still do urban exploration, still make videos for my channel, but I've never posted the footage from Lynch. I've kept it private, showed it only to the other explorers who had similar experiences. We've formed a kind of informal support group, checking in with each other, sharing any new symptoms or experiences. 2 of them report the same nighttime aches I have. One of them says they can sometimes feel something moving under the scar tissue, something that shouldn't be there. I don't know what happened in that hospital. I don't know if those shadow figures were ghosts of surgeons who used to work there, if they were something else entirely, or if the building itself was somehow alive and performing its own twisted version of the procedures that once took place there. All I know is that I went into that building whole, and I came out changed. Something was done to me in those 7 missing minutes. Something was put inside me, and I have no idea what it is or what it's supposed to do. The scar tissue is thicker than it should be now, 6 months later. My doctor says that's unusual but not impossible. What he doesn't say, but what I can see in his eyes, is that he's never seen tissue heal quite like this. It's denser, tougher, almost like it's not entirely human tissue anymore. I've stopped going to doctors about it. They can't help, and their tests just raise more questions than answers. Sometimes, late at night, when that ache gets particularly bad, I pull up the footage on my computer and watch those shadow figures work on me. I watch myself lying on that table, completely still, while they perform their procedure with professional precision. And I wonder if they're finished with me, or if that hospital burning down interrupted something they started. I wonder if whatever they put inside me is still there, still changing, still doing whatever it was designed to do. I keep my cameras charged and ready. I document the scar every week, taking photos, measuring it, noting any changes. It's growing, slowly but definitely growing, spreading outward from the original incision site. The tissue is harder now, and sometimes in certain light it looks almost translucent, like I can see something underneath it. Something that moves. But I'm not going back to any doctors. I'm not going back to that site in Lynch. I'm just waiting, documenting, and trying to understand what was done to me in those 7 minutes I can't remember. Whatever those shadow surgeons started, it's not finished. I can feel it every time that scar aches, every time I notice it's grown a little more. They put something inside me, and it's still there, waiting for whatever comes next. My name is Lewis, and I've been dealing in rare books for 23 years. I own a small shop in Asheville, North Carolina, tucked away on a side street in the downtown area where the old buildings still have character, and the rent hasn't gotten completely insane yet. I specialize in occult literature, first editions, unusual volumes that most mainstream bookstores wouldn't touch. It's a niche market, but it's sustained me well enough. I've handled books on everything from alchemy to ceremonial magic, herbalism to demonology. I thought I'd seen every type of collector, every kind of obsession. Then Hugo started visiting my shop in November 2008, and I learned that some collectors aren't just obsessed with knowledge. Some of them are looking for very specific instructions on how to maintain something they've been doing for a very, very long time. Hugo first came into my shop on November 4th, 2008, a Tuesday evening around 7:30. I remember because it was raining hard, one of those cold mountain rains that comes down in sheets, and I was about to close up early since no one had been in for hours. Then the bell above my door chimed, and he walked in. Not a drop of water on him despite the storm outside. He was elderly, or at least he looked elderly, maybe 70 or 75, with silver hair combed back from a high forehead, wearing an expensive-looking dark coat and carrying a black umbrella that he shook out carefully before setting it in the stand by the door. "Good evening," he said, his voice cultured and precise, with an accent I couldn't quite place. European, certainly, but mixed with something else. "I apologize for the late hour. I saw your lights were still on." I told him it was fine, that I was open for another half hour anyway. He smiled, a polite expression that didn't quite reach his eyes, and began browsing the shelves with the kind of focused attention that told me he knew exactly what he was looking for. He moved slowly through the store, occasionally pulling out a volume, examining it carefully, then replacing it with deliberate precision. After about 20 minutes, he brought 3 books to my counter. All 3 were about blood, not medical texts, but occult works. One was a 19th century French grimoire on blood rituals. Another was a Victorian-era treatise on the life force contained in blood. And the third was a more modern work from the 1970s about blood magic in various cultural traditions. Not the strangest collection I'd ever sold. I'd had customers buy weirder combinations. But something about the way he handled them, the way his fingers lingered on the covers, made me slightly uncomfortable. "These are exactly what I need," he said, pulling out a wallet that looked like it might be older than I was. He paid in cash, crisp $100 bills that he counted out carefully. "Do you acquire new inventory regularly?" I told him I did, that I attended estate sales and auctions, that I had connections with other dealers. He nodded, seeming pleased, and asked if he could leave his contact information for any future acquisitions related to his area of interest. I gave him one of my customer cards to fill out, and he wrote down a phone number in handwriting that was beautiful and old-fashioned, the kind they don't teach anymore. No address, just the name Hugo and a local number. "I only receive calls after sunset," he said, handing the card back. "I hope that won't be an inconvenience." I assured him it wouldn't be, and he left with his books carefully wrapped in brown paper. The bell chimed as he departed, and through my front window, I watched him walk down the rain-soaked street and disappear around the corner. He never opened his umbrella, I noticed, just carried it at his side while the rain poured down, and somehow he still didn't seem wet. Over the next 3 months, Hugo became my best customer. He came in every week, always after dark, always when the shop was nearly empty of other customers. He bought consistently, and always books related to blood, historical accounts of blood rituals, medical texts from centuries past about bloodletting and transfusion, anthropological studies of blood in religious ceremonies, even some rather disturbing medieval manuscripts about blood preservation. I ordered books specifically for him, knowing his interests, and he paid premium prices without haggling. We developed a rapport, the kind you do with regular customers. He was educated, well-spoken, could discuss the historical context of the books he bought with genuine scholarship. He claimed to be writing a comprehensive history of humanity's relationship with blood across cultures and time periods. It seemed plausible. I'd sold to academics before, though usually they wanted books on loan or were working with limited budgets. Hugo simply bought everything, price no object. It was in February 2009, during one of his visits, that I noticed something odd. I'd been rearranging my shop's display area and had put up some old photographs I'd acquired at an estate sale. Pictures of Asheville from the 1920s, back when the downtown area was first being developed. Hugo stopped in front of one photograph, a street scene from 1923, and I saw his expression change. Not much, just a slight tightening around his eyes. "That's Pack Square," I said, coming over to look at the photo with him. "Amazing how much has changed, right?" He didn't respond immediately, just stared at the photograph. It showed a crowd of people in period dress, and in the background, barely visible, was what looked like a bookstore. I squinted at it, trying to read the faded sign, and felt a chill when I realized the storefront was on the same street where my shop now stood. "I remember when that was taken," Hugo said quietly, then seemed to catch himself. "Or rather, my grandfather told me about that day. He lived here back then." But that wasn't what made my skin prickle. What made me take a closer look at the photograph was the figure standing near the edge of the frame, partially turned away from the camera. A man in a dark coat, carrying what looked like an umbrella, with silver hair visible beneath his hat. The resemblance to Hugo was striking. Not just family resemblance, identical. "Your grandfather?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "Yes," Hugo said, stepping back from the photograph. "Remarkable resemblance, isn't it? I'm told I look exactly like him." He changed the subject then, asking if I'd managed to acquire a particular volume he'd requested, and I let it drop. But after he left that night, I took the photograph down and examined it more closely with a magnifying glass. The man in the picture could have been Hugo's twin, or Hugo himself, somehow photographed in 1923. I started paying more attention after that. Little things I'd overlooked before became significant. Hugo never came in before sunset, claimed he worked night shifts, and preferred evening hours. He never aged, not even slightly, despite my seeing him weekly for months. His skin had a quality to it, almost translucent in certain lights, and I never once saw him blink when we were in conversation. His hands were always cool when he handed me money, even on warm evenings. And there were the books themselves. I started reading some of them before he picked them up, just out of curiosity about what exactly he was researching. They weren't just about blood in an academic sense. Many of them contained specific instructions: how to preserve blood for long-term storage, historical methods of blood consumption, rituals designed to extend life through blood, medieval beliefs about blood transfer and immortality. One particularly disturbing volume from the 1600s described something the author called the eternal vintage, a method by which certain individuals could supposedly sustain themselves indefinitely through regular blood intake. In March, Hugo asked if I'd be interested in viewing his private collection. He said he had volumes that might interest me, that perhaps we could arrange some trades or loans. He mentioned he had a small estate in the mountains outside Asheville, about an hour's drive, and that he'd be honored if I'd visit some evening. Against my better judgment, but driven by curiosity and the prospect of seeing truly rare books, I agreed. We arranged for me to visit on March 15th, 2009. Hugo gave me detailed directions to his property, a winding route up into the mountains that took me far from any main roads. The sun was setting as I drove, the sky turning that particular shade of purple it gets in the mountains just before full dark. His estate, when I finally found it, was breathtaking. A stone mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from Europe, surrounded by ancient trees, and sitting on what must have been 50 acres of private land. Hugo greeted me at the door, dressed formally despite the casual nature of my visit. He led me through rooms filled with antique furniture, paintings that looked genuinely old, and decorative objects that I suspected were worth more than my entire shop. The library was on the second floor, and when he opened the doors, I understood why he'd wanted me to see it. The room was enormous, 2 stories tall with a gallery running around the upper level. Every wall was floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and every shelf was packed with volumes. But it wasn't just the quantity, it was the quality. I could see from across the room that many of these books were centuries old, genuine artifacts. Hugo smiled at my expression and gestured for me to explore. I spent 2 hours there, carefully examining books I'd only read about in dealer catalogs, volumes I'd assumed were lost or locked away in museum collections, medical texts from the Renaissance, illuminated manuscripts on blood magic from medieval monasteries, first editions of works by Paracelsus and other alchemists, and mixed among them stranger things, handwritten journals in various languages, some dating back centuries, all focused on the same theme: longevity, immortality, the preservation of life through blood. "These journals," I said, holding one carefully. The leather binding was worn but well maintained. "Are these from your family?" "In a sense," Hugo said. He was standing by the window, looking out at the darkened forest. "They represent a kind of family history, accumulated wisdom, you might say." I opened the journal to a random page. The handwriting was beautiful, the same old-fashioned script I'd seen Hugo use. The entry was dated April 3rd, 1847, and described something the writer called the necessity. It spoke about finding suitable donors, about the careful balance required to sustain oneself without drawing attention, about the loneliness of watching decades pass while remaining unchanged. My hands started shaking. I set the journal down carefully and picked up another. Different leather, different age, but the same handwriting. This one dated from 1792. Another from 1923, the year of that photograph. Another from 1856. 6 different journals spanning over 200 years, all in identical handwriting. All signed with the same name: Hugo. I turned to find him watching me, his expression calm and patient, like a teacher waiting for a student to understand a complex lesson. "You've realized," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's impossible," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "You can't be... people don't what?" Hugo moved closer, his movements fluid and somehow wrong, too graceful for someone who appeared elderly. "Don't live for centuries, don't sustain themselves through methods that most of humanity considers myth. Lewis, you've been selling me instruction manuals for months. Surely you suspected." I backed toward the door, but he raised a hand, not threateningly, just a gesture of patience. "Please, don't be alarmed. If I intended you harm, I could have done so any of the dozen times you were alone with me in your shop. I brought you here to make you an offer, not a threat." "What kind of offer?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. Hugo gestured to the library around us. "I'm old, Lewis. So old that sometimes I forget what year it is, what century. I've accumulated wealth, knowledge, experiences that most people can't imagine. But it's exhausting. The constant vigilance, the need to move every few decades before people notice I'm not aging, the isolation of watching everyone I've known turn to dust. I maintain this existence because the alternative, true death, is terrifying in a way you can't understand until you've lived as long as I have." He paused, studying my face. "But sometimes I consider taking an apprentice, someone who could share this burden, who could help maintain the knowledge I've accumulated. Someone who appreciates rare books and obscure knowledge. He smiled, and for the first time I saw his teeth. Perfectly white, perfectly normal, except for the incisors that were just slightly too long. Someone like you. You're asking me to become... I couldn't finish the sentence. Like me. Yes, it's a simple process, relatively painless. An exchange of blood, certain rituals performed at the right time. You'd have time, Lewis, centuries of it. Time to read every book ever written, to learn every language, to master any subject that interests you. The cost is merely dietary, and I assure you, it becomes easier with practice. I stood there, in that magnificent library, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, looking at a man who claimed to have lived through events I'd only read about in history books. Part of me, the curious part that had driven me into the rare book business in the first place, wanted to say yes. Wanted to ask questions to understand how this was possible, to learn everything he knew. But a larger part of me, the part that still felt human, still felt connected to normal life despite my odd profession, was horrified. I can't, I said. I'm sorry, but I can't. Hugo nodded, seeming unsurprised. I suspected as much. You have the curiosity, but not the isolation necessary for this existence. You still have friends, family, connections. Those become obstacles, eventually. He walked to his desk and pulled out a business card, different from the one he'd given me before. If you change your mind, this number will reach me. It will always reach me, no matter how many years pass. I check it regularly. He escorted me back to the main entrance, perfectly polite, as if we'd just concluded a normal business meeting. At the door, he paused. I trust I can count on your discretion. I've been buying books from dealers in this region for over a century, and I'd prefer to continue doing so. It would be inconvenient if I had to relocate due to unfortunate rumors. It wasn't quite a threat, but the implication was clear. I nodded, not trusting. My voice, and he handed me my coat. Safe travels, Lewis. And do remember, the offer stands. I've learned to be patient. I have, after all, nothing but time. I drove home in a daze, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my mind racing. When I got back to my apartment, I pulled out every photograph I had from the shop, every picture of Asheville's history I'd collected over the years, and I found him. Hugo, or someone who looked exactly like him, in photos from 1923, 1947, 1965, 1989, always in the background, never quite the focus, but there. Always there. I never called the number he gave me. I kept it, though, tucked away in my wallet where I see it sometimes when I'm paying for something. Hugo continued visiting my shop for another 6 months, always polite, always buying his strange books, never mentioning that night at his estate. Then, in September 2009, he came in one last time. I'm relocating, he said simply. Europe, I think. It's been long enough that I can return to some of the old places without raising questions. Thank you for your service, Lewis. You have excellent taste in inventory. He bought one final book, a first edition of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which I thought showed a sense of humor. In case you're curious, he said as he was leaving, Stoker got some of it right, most of it wrong, but the essential truth, that there are things in this world that feed on life to sustain their own. That part he understood. That was 16 years ago. I'm 41 now, still running my shop, still dealing in rare books. I've had other unusual customers over the years, but none like Hugo. I keep tabs on rare book dealers in Europe now, watching for reports of an elderly gentleman buying occult texts about blood. I found a few mentions here and there, dealers in London and Prague describing a customer who sounds very familiar. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my shop, I pull out that business card and wonder what he's doing now, what century of existence he's living through. Wonder if he's found his apprentice, or if he's still alone, still collecting his books, and his knowledge, and his carefully maintained secrets. Wonder if I made the right choice that night, turning down the offer of centuries in favor of a normal human lifespan. I'm aging now in ways Hugo never will. Gray is starting to show in my hair, lines appearing around my eyes. I have maybe 40 or 50 good years left if I'm lucky, and Hugo will still be there, somewhere, still buying books, still learning, still existing in the shadows while the world changes around him, still patient, still waiting, because time means nothing when you have forever. I've never told anyone this story. Who would believe it? But I keep that business card, and I keep finding Hugo in historical photographs from my city. And I keep wondering if someday, when I'm much older and death feels less theoretical and more imminent, I might change my mind, might make that call, might accept the offer of more time in exchange for becoming something that hunts in the dark and feeds on what keeps others alive. For now, I'm still human, still mortal, still running my little shop and selling my rare books to customers who probably aren't secretly centuries old. Probably. But I've learned that the world contains stranger things than most people imagine, that some collectors are pursuing knowledge for reasons that go far beyond academic interest, and that some offers, once made, never really expire. They just wait, patient and persistent, for the moment when fear of death outweighs fear of what you might become. Hugo is still out there, still reading, still learning, still waiting, and the card in my wallet, with its single phone number, is still valid. I checked once a few years ago. I called from a payphone, not giving my name, and a familiar cultured voice answered after one ring. "Hello, Lewis," Hugo said, as if no time had passed at all. "I've been patient. When you're ready, call again." Then he hung up, leaving me standing there with the phone in my hand, wondering how he knew it was me, wondering if someday I'll call back with a different answer. My name is Alana, and I host the Midnight Shift on WMTN, a tiny community radio station in Spruce Pine, North Carolina. It's not glamorous work. The station runs on donations and a shoestring budget, broadcasting from a converted house on the edge of town. My show runs from midnight to 4 a.m., playing a mix of indie music, taking call-ins from insomniacs, and talking about whatever comes to mind. The audience is small, maybe a few hundred people on a good night, but they're loyal. Or they were, until November 2015, when something started interrupting my broadcasts. Something that knew things it shouldn't know, that spoke in voices that shouldn't exist, and that showed me a future I'm still trying to prevent. It started on November 3rd, 2015, a Tuesday night that began like any other. I'd arrived at the station around 11:30 p.m., made my usual pot of coffee that would keep me wired until dawn, and settled into the booth to prep for the show. The equipment at WMTN is ancient. The mixing board dates from the 80s. The microphones are older than I am, and we still use CDs and vinyl because our streaming setup is barely functional. But it works, and there's something authentic about analog broadcasting that I've always loved. No auto-tune, no digital polish, just raw sound going out over the airwaves into the night. I went live at midnight, greeting my regular listeners, playing my opening song, settling into the rhythm of the show. Everything was normal until about 12:40 a.m., right in the middle of a track by some local band. The music cut out suddenly, replaced by static, and then a voice came through. Not my voice, I wasn't speaking, but a child's voice, high and clear, reciting numbers. 35.7629, negative 82.1543, depth 47 feet, November 18th, bring the blue-handled flashlight. Then the music came back like nothing had happened. I sat there stunned, my hand frozen over the controls. I hadn't touched anything. The CD was still playing normally. But that voice had come through my broadcast, clear as day, speaking coordinates and instructions that made no sense. I checked all the equipment, looking for a malfunction, but everything showed normal. I made a joke on air about technical difficulties, played another song, and tried to forget about it. But it happened again 20 minutes later. Same thing, music cutting out, static, then a child's voice. Different child this time, younger sounding, also reciting coordinates. 35.8142, negative 82.2791, depth 18 feet, November 23rd, the red door on the left. I started recording after that, keeping a backup track of everything that went out over the air. The interruptions continued throughout the night, maybe a dozen times total. Always children's voices, always coordinates followed by dates in November, and cryptic instructions. My listeners were calling in, asking what was going on, if it was some kind of art project or ARG. I had no answers for them. I reported it to my station manager the next morning, but he just shrugged and said it was probably interference from another broadcaster, some pirate radio operator playing games. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. I'm not particularly tech-savvy, but I know enough about radio to understand that kind of precise, repeated interference isn't normal, and those coordinates meant something. I'm originally from this area, grew up hiking these mountains, and I recognized the general range. They were all locations within maybe 20 miles of spruce pine, scattered through the surrounding national forest. On November 4th, I decided to check out the first set of coordinates. I'm not proud of how obsessive I got about this, but something about those children's voices felt urgent, important. I drove out to the location during the afternoon, using my phone's GPS to navigate the forest roads. The coordinates led me to an area off Highway 226, down a dirt road that was barely maintained, into woods thick with old-growth trees and mountain laurel. I hiked in with the coordinates pulled up on my phone, following the GPS marker until I reached the exact spot. There was nothing obviously unusual, just forest, a slight depression in the ground covered with leaves. But the voice had said depth, 47 feet, so I started clearing away leaves and debris. About 6 inches down, I hit something hard. Wood, old and weathered but still solid. I dug around it with my hands, getting my nails dirty, until I'd exposed what looked like a hatch or door set into the ground. It took all my strength to pull it open, the hinges screaming with rust and disuse. Underneath was darkness, a vertical shaft going down with metal rungs set into the side. My phone's flashlight showed the shaft going down at least 40 feet, maybe more. At the bottom, I could see a flat surface and what looked like a tunnel entrance. An old mine, I realized. This whole area used to be full of mica mines, most of them abandoned decades ago. But why would a pirate radio signal be directing me to an abandoned mine shaft? I should have left then, should have reported it to authorities and let them investigate. But I climbed down instead, using those rusty rungs, my phone clenched between my teeth for light. The shaft was deeper than it looked, and by the time I reached the bottom, my arms were shaking. The tunnel entrance led into darkness, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. I followed it, maybe 30 feet, the beam of my phone cutting through absolute blackness until I found what I was looking for. Broadcast equipment. Old, but not abandoned, old. Maintained old. There was a generator still running, a low hum I could feel through my feet, a transmitter setup with cables running deeper into the mine, and recording equipment, reel-to-reel tape machines, the kind that haven't been manufactured in decades but that someone was clearly still using. The reels were turning slowly, playing back or recording, I couldn't tell which. I moved closer, trying to understand what I was seeing. That's when I noticed the labels on the tapes. Dates. November 2015, November 2016, November 2017, going forward year by year. Tapes labeled with dates that hadn't happened yet. I picked up the one marked November 2015, this month, this year, and held it up to the light. Through the clear leader tape, I could see recording medium, something definitely on there. My hands were shaking as I found the playback machine and threaded the tape. The sound that came out of the speakers made my blood run cold. It was my voice, my exact voice, speaking words I'd never said. This is Alana on WMTN, and I need to tell you what I've found. The coordinates they're giving aren't random. They're locations where something terrible is going to happen. November 18th, there will be a cave collapse on the western ridge. November 23rd, a fire at the old church on Morton Street. I'm trying to warn people, but nobody believes me. Nobody listens until it's too late. I stopped the tape, my heart hammering. That was my voice, my speech patterns, but I'd never recorded those words. And the dates. November 18th was still 2 weeks away. November 23rd was 3 weeks out. I fast-forwarded the tape, hearing more of my voice describing events, giving warnings, sounding increasingly desperate. Then other voices, news reports, emergency broadcasts, describing the exact events my recorded self had tried to warn about. The tape for November 2016 was worse. My voice again, but different. Tired. Broken. This is my second year trying to change things. Last year, 12 people died because I couldn't convince anyone. I'm recording this in advance, hoping that when the broadcasts start again, someone will listen this time. The coordinates are where you need to be to stop what's coming. Please, if you're hearing this, if you're me from the past, don't ignore the signals. They're not coming from outside. They're coming from you, from me, from us trying to fix what we couldn't fix before. I listened to tape after tape, year after year, my voice getting more desperate, more broken, describing events that hadn't happened yet, but that I knew would happen because I could hear the aftermath recorded there, in that mine. A pattern emerged. Every November, the broadcast would start. Every November, I would investigate. Every November, I would find this mine and these tapes. And every November, I would fail to prevent the disasters the broadcasts warned about. The November 2020 tape was different. My voice was calm, resigned. This is year 6. I understand now. The equipment isn't receiving signals from the future. It's creating them. The mine has some kind of temporal loop, and the broadcasts are echoes of every November I've lived and will live, all bleeding together. The children's voices aren't children. They're artifacts, corrupted audio from my own voice, degraded through the loop. I'm the pirate broadcaster. I've always been the pirate broadcaster. I just haven't done it yet. I stood in that dark mine, surrounded by tapes of my own future, and felt my reality crumbling. The generator hummed. The tape reels turned. And somewhere in that equipment, I could hear a new recording starting. My own voice from just moments ago. My hands were shaking as I found the playback machine and threaded the tape. It was recording me right now, capturing this moment, adding it to the loop that would broadcast back to some past version of myself who hadn't found this place yet. I ran, climbed that shaft faster than I should have, scraping my hands on the rusty rungs, gasping for air when I reached the surface. I drove back to town in a daze, my mind trying to process what I'd seen, what I'd heard. That night's broadcast was torture. The interruptions came again, children's voices reciting coordinates, and now I knew. Those were my future self's attempts to guide me, degraded through years of temporal recycling until they were barely recognizable. I started following the coordinates, all of them. Every location the broadcast gave me, I visited. Some were mines like the first. Others were caves, abandoned buildings, places where that same strange equipment was set up, humming with power that came from somewhere other than the power grid. And at each location, more tapes, more recordings of my future self, trying to warn, trying to change things, trying to break the loop. November 18th came. The broadcast had given coordinates for the Western Ridge. I went there at the time specified, found 3 hikers about to enter a cave system. I told them not to go in, made up a story about structural instability. They laughed at me, went in anyway. 2 hours later, part of the cave system collapsed. 2 of the hikers died. The 3rd survived and told reporters about a crazy radio host who tried to warn them. November 23rd, I staked out the old church on Morton Street. The broadcast had been clear about this one. I called in a bomb threat, completely anonymous, anything to get people away from that building. The police evacuated it. 3 hours later, faulty electrical wiring started a fire that would have killed the dozen people who'd been inside for choir practice. I'd save them, but at the cost of being investigated for making false emergency calls. The authorities didn't believe my story about time-looped broadcasts and future warnings. Why would they? I sounded insane. I was put on administrative leave from the station, required to undergo psychiatric evaluation. And all the while, the broadcasts continued, now bleeding into other people's radios, other frequencies. My future self's warnings spreading wider as the temporal loop grew stronger. I'm writing this in November 2024, 9 years after I first heard those broadcasts. I've spent every November since trying to prevent the disasters the signals warn about. Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fail, and every year I add new recordings to the equipment in those mines, new warnings encoded in new coordinates, hoping that some past version of myself will listen better than I did, will figure it out faster, will break the loop that I seem to be creating through my attempts to prevent it. The equipment keeps running, the tapes keep recording, and every November the cycle begins again. I've tried destroying the equipment, but there's too much of it, scattered through too many locations. I've tried leaving town, but the broadcasts find me anyway, interrupting whatever radio I'm near, pulling me back. I've tried ignoring them, but then people die, and I hear about it on the news, and I know I could have prevented it if I'd just followed the coordinates. River, my station manager, thinks I've had some kind of breakdown. Maybe I have. Maybe none of this is real, and I'm just experiencing some elaborate delusion brought on by too many lonely midnight shifts and too much coffee. But I don't think so. The evidence is too concrete. The tapes are too real. The disasters I've prevented are too well documented. What terrifies me most is the tape I found last week, labeled November 2025. My voice on it sounds different. Not desperate or resigned, but somehow absent, like I'm reading from a script without understanding the words. And the coordinates it gives lead to the radio station itself, to the booth where I've spent so many midnights. The date specified is November 30th, 2025, still a year away. The instruction is simple. Bring the recorder. Finish the loop. I don't know what that means yet, but I have a year to figure it out. A year to decide if I'm going to follow those coordinates or try once more to break the cycle. The broadcasts continue every November, my degraded voice giving warnings to whoever will listen. Most people think it's a hoax, some elaborate prank by the weird late-night radio host. They don't know I'm as confused as they are, that I'm trying to warn myself as much as I'm trying to warn them. The equipment in those mines keeps running, keeps recording, keeps broadcasting backwards, through time, or sideways, through reality, or wherever these signals actually go. And I keep hosting my midnight show, keep hearing my own future, interrupting my present, keep trying to save people from disasters that might not even happen if I could just figure out how to stop recording them in the first place. November comes every year like clockwork. And every year, the broadcasts start again. Children's voices that aren't children reciting coordinates that lead to versions of myself I haven't become yet. The loop continues. The warnings multiply. And somewhere in those dark minds, tapes are recording moments that haven't happened yet but somehow already exist, waiting to be broadcast back to a past that keeps becoming the present, where I'm still trying to understand what I've already done and what I'm about to do. I'm tired. So tired of living the same month over and over with slight variations, of hearing my own voice warn me about things I can't prevent or can only partially stop. But I can't stop, won't stop, because as long as the broadcasts continue, as long as there's a chance that this November will be different, that I'll finally break the loop or understand its purpose, I have to keep trying. The static between stations sounds like children now, even when I'm not at work. And sometimes, in that static, I can hear myself speaking words I haven't learned yet, giving warnings about events I haven't witnessed, trapped in a broadcast that started before I was born and will continue long after I'm gone. The loop is bigger than me, older than me, and I'm just the voice it chose to use this time around. November 2025 is coming. The coordinates are waiting, and I still don't know if following them will end this or just make it worse. But I'll be there, in that booth, with my recorder, ready to finish whatever this loop needs me to finish. 'Cause that's what the future version of me recorded. And maybe that's the only way any of this makes sense. If I stop trying to prevent it and just let it complete itself, whatever that means. The broadcasts continue, the tapes keep turning, and somewhere in the static between stations, I'm still warning myself about a future I've already lived and a past I haven't reached yet. Welcome to WMTN, where the midnight shift never really ends and time is just another frequency we're all trying to tune into. My name is Winston, and I'm 52 years old. I've worked for the U.S. Forest Service for the past 28 years, spending most of that time as a wildlife biologist in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I've dedicated my life to understanding and protecting the ecosystems of these ancient mountains, studying everything from black bear populations to the effects of acid rain on forest health. I thought I understood the natural world, thought I'd seen every variation of predator-prey dynamics, every adaptation species could make to survive. Then November 2003 happened, and I learned that nature can evolve in directions we never imagined, that the line between plant and animal isn't as fixed as we thought, and that sometimes conservation means preserving something that's conserving us right back. It started with reports from hikers in early November 2003. People were calling the ranger station, talking about a valley off the Shavers Fork Trail where they'd seen deer standing perfectly still like statues, not moving even when approached. At first, we thought it might be a disease, something like chronic wasting disease that affects cervid behavior. I was assigned to investigate on November 7th, 2003, along with a ranger named Bleak, who knew the area well. We hiked in early that morning, the temperature hovering around 38 degrees, our breath visible in the cold mountain air. The valley was about 3 miles off the main trail, accessible only by a narrow path that wound through dense forest. The trees there were old growth, massive oaks and maples that had been standing for centuries, their trunks wider than a car. The understory was thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel, creating a green tunnel effect that blocked out most of the sky. We smelled it before we saw it, a sweet, almost floral scent that seemed wrong for November, when most plants had gone dormant for winter. Blake commented on it first, saying it smelled like springtime, like everything was blooming at once. We followed the scent deeper into the valley, our boots crunching on fallen leaves, until we reached a clearing and saw what the hikers had reported. Deer. 7 of them, standing in a rough circle in the middle of the clearing. They weren't moving, not breathing heavily from exertion, not twitching their ears to listen for predators, not doing any of the constant small movements that living animals make, just standing, perfectly still, their eyes open and glassy. We approached cautiously, and they didn't react. I got within 10 feet of the nearest one, a young buck with 6 points, and it still didn't move. I reached out and touched its flank. The fur felt normal, the body was warm, but there was no reaction, no flinch, no startled jump, nothing. It was like touching a very realistic statue. Blake circled around to check the others, while I examined the buck more closely. That's when I noticed the vegetation. The deer's hooves were partially buried in the forest floor, but it wasn't just dirt covering them. Plant matter, moss, small vines, root structures, had grown up and around the hooves, anchoring them in place. I knelt down for a closer look and saw that the growth wasn't just surrounding the hooves, it was integrated with them. The plant tissue seemed to be merging with the animal tissue, growing into it, becoming part of it. "You need to see this," Blake called from across the clearing. He was kneeling next to a doe, and when I joined him, I saw what had alarmed him. The doe's legs weren't just anchored, they were transforming. The lower portions of the legs showed clear signs of lignification, the process by which plant cells develop woody tissue. The fur was thinning, being replaced by something that looked like bark. and from the dough's back, small green shoots were emerging, tiny branches with leaves that were photosynthesizing in the weak November sunlight. We spent 2 hours documenting everything, taking photographs, collecting tissue samples, measuring the extent of the plant integration. All 7 deer showed the same pattern, progressive transformation starting from the hooves and moving upward, plant tissue replacing or merging with animal tissue. But here's what made it truly bizarre. The deer were alive. I could detect faint heartbeats when I pressed my stethoscope against their chests. Slow, maybe 1 beat every 30 seconds, but present. Their eyes would occasionally blink once every few minutes. They were alive, but functioning at such a reduced metabolic rate that they were essentially in stasis. The vegetation in the clearing was unusual too. Everything was interconnected, a dense network of roots and mycorrhizal fungi that linked all the plants together. When I dug down to examine the root structure around one deer, I found that the roots from multiple plant species had fused together, creating a unified system. And all of it led back to a massive oak tree at the center of the clearing, easily 400 years old, with a trunk 12 feet in diameter. We returned to the station, and I immediately started making calls. This was beyond anything in my experience, beyond anything in the scientific literature I could find. I contacted colleagues at universities, at the CDC, at wildlife disease labs. Nobody had seen anything like it. We quarantined the valley, put up warning signs, and I organized a full research team to come in and study what was happening. Over the next week, I visited the valley every day, sometimes alone, sometimes with Bleak or other researchers, and every day the transformation progressed. The deer were becoming more plant-like, more integrated into the forest ecosystem. By November 14th, 3 of them had leaves growing from their backs, branches extending upward toward the canopy. Their eyes had taken on a greenish tint, and when I examined them under magnification, I could see chloroplasts, the cellular structures that allow plants to photosynthesize, present in the tissue. But the strangest part was what happened to me on November 15th. I'd been spending hours in that valley every day, taking samples, making observations, breathing in that sweet floral scent. That morning, I woke up and noticed something odd. My hands, when I held them up to the morning light coming through my bedroom window, looked slightly green. Not obviously so, not like I'd been painted, but a subtle tint beneath the skin. I went to the bathroom and examined myself in the mirror. My skin, everywhere, had that same faint greenish cast. I called in sick and drove to the nearest hospital in Elkins. The doctor who examined me was puzzled. My vitals were normal, blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, all fine. But when he drew blood, it came out slightly green-tinged. The lab results showed chlorophyll in my bloodstream. Chlorophyll, the molecule that plants use to capture light energy. It was in my blood, in measurable concentrations, and nobody could explain how it got there. I should have stopped going to the valley then, should have reported myself as contaminated, submitted to quarantine and study. But I didn't, because something strange was happening to me, something that felt less like disease and more like evolution. I was changing, yes, but I was also becoming more efficient. I needed less food. My thinking was clearer, and when I stood in sunlight, I could feel energy flowing into me, a gentle warmth that seemed to nourish me at a cellular level. I went back to the valley on November 18th, alone this time. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to see how far the transformation had progressed. The deer were barely recognizable now. They'd become hybrid organisms, part animal and part tree, their bodies serving as living supports for the growing plant matter that had consumed them. But they weren't dead. When I checked, I could still detect those slow heartbeats. They were alive in some new form, sustained by photosynthesis rather than eating, breathing through leaves rather than lungs. I sat down at the base of that central oak tree, my back against its rough bark, and I felt something. A connection. a vast patient awareness that flowed through the root network, through the fungal connections, through all the interconnected life in that valley. The tree was old, ancient, and it had learned something over its centuries of growth. It had learned to integrate, to merge with other life forms, to create hybrid organisms that combine the best aspects of plant and animal. The deer weren't victims. They were partners in a new kind of existence. And I was becoming a partner too. I could feel the chlorophyll spreading through my system, feel my metabolism shifting, feel myself becoming something new. When I stood up and walked through the valley, I realized I could sense the other organisms around me through the root network. I could feel the slow thoughts of the oak tree, the patient waiting of the transformed deer, the complex chemical communications happening beneath the soil. Time started feeling different. My perception slowed to match the time scale of plants rather than animals. Hours would pass and feel like minutes. I'd stand in one spot, not moving, just absorbing sunlight through my increasingly green skin. And it would feel natural, right? More efficient than the constant frenetic movement that animals engage in. Blake found me there on November 20th, 3 days after I'd gone in. He'd been worried when I didn't respond to radio calls, came looking for me with a search team. They found me standing near the deer, my skin obviously green now, my feet partially rooted into the soil. He tried to get me to leave, to come back to the station for medical help, but I couldn't make him understand. I didn't need help. I was becoming something better, something that didn't need to consume other life to survive, that could draw energy directly from the sun. They forced me out anyway, physically pulled me from the valley, and the disconnection was agony. Being separated from that root network felt like having part of my mind ripped away. They took me to a hospital in Morgantown, put me in isolation, ran every test they could think of. The results were impossible. My cells contained both animal and plant organelles. I was photosynthesizing at about 20% efficiency, enough to meet a significant portion of my caloric needs. My DNA showed signs of horizontal gene transfer, plant genes integrating into my human genome in ways that shouldn't be possible outside of laboratory genetic engineering. I spent 3 weeks in that hospital while specialists tried to understand and reverse what was happening to me. They couldn't reverse it. The changes were too deep, too integrated into my cellular structure. But they did stabilize me, kept me in a state where I was still mostly human, mostly functional in human society. They put me on a treatment regimen, special nutrients, UV light therapy, keeping my photosynthetic processes active enough that they wouldn't try to progress further to compensate. The Forest Service quarantined the valley, set up a perimeter, prohibited all access, designated it as a contaminated zone. They sent in teams in hazmat suits to study the phenomenon, but the suits prevented the kind of extended exposure I'd had. The deer remained there, continuing their slow transformation, becoming living trees that stood as testament to what the forest could do when it learned to cross kingdom boundaries. I was medically retired from the Forest Service in January 2004. They gave me a full pension and made me sign non-disclosure agreements about what had happened. But I couldn't stay away from the forest. I bought a small cabin on the edge of the Monongahela, as close to that quarantine valley as I was legally allowed to get, and I've lived here for the past 20 years. The changes have continued slowly. My skin is green year-round now, obviously so, though I can pass for having a strange skin condition if I wear long sleeves and keep my face covered. I eat very little, maybe one small meal every few days. Most of my energy comes from sunlight. I spend hours every day just standing outside, my face turned toward the sun, absorbing photons and converting them to chemical energy. It's peaceful, efficient. I don't get cold anymore because I've learned to enter a kind of dormancy during winter, my metabolism slowing to a crawl until spring brings longer days and stronger light. But here's what the Forest Service doesn't know, what I haven't told anyone. I can still feel that valley. Even miles away, even separated by fences and quarantine zones, I can feel the network. The root systems extend far beyond that single valley, connecting trees across hundreds of acres. And through those connections, I can sense others like me. Not many, maybe a dozen, but they're out there. Hikers who spent too long in the wrong valleys, researchers who got too close, people who are slowly transforming into something that exists between the animal and plant kingdoms. We don't communicate in words. It's more like shared sensation, chemical signals that flow through the root network and get translated into understanding. We know we're changing. We know we're becoming something unprecedented in Earth's history. And we know that the forest is doing this deliberately, that the ancient trees have figured out how to create hybrid organisms that can bridge the gap between different forms of life. The calendar says I'm 52 years old, but I don't age anymore. Not in the normal way. My cells repair themselves using mechanisms copied from plants, which can live for thousands of years. I might live to see the next century, or the one after that. I require less and less from the human world. Less food, less shelter, less of the constant consumption that defines human existence. Becoming self-sufficient in a way that humans never have been, powered by sunlight and connected to an ecosystem that will outlast civilization. Sometimes I wonder if I should be frightened, if I should be fighting harder to reverse this transformation. But when I stand in the sun and feel that warm energy flowing into me, when I sense the vast, slow thoughts of the forest network, when I experience the peace of existing without the constant animal panic of needing to hunt and eat and compete, I can't bring myself to see it as a loss, becoming something new, something sustainable. The valley is still there, still quarantined, still slowly transforming any animal that stays too long. The Forest Service monitors it remotely but doesn't understand what they're really seeing. They think it's contamination, disease, something to be contained. They don't realize it's evolution, adaptation, the forest learning to incorporate new types of life into its ancient systems. And now, part of it, part plant, part animal, part something that doesn't have a name yet. Still thinking like a human most of the time. Still having memories and personality and individual identity. But those things are fading slowly, being replaced by something calmer, slower, more patient. In another 20 years, might be more tree than man. In 100 years, might just be a strange oak growing at the edge of the forest, with greenish bark and a trunk that's oddly warm to the touch. Still technically alive in some form that combines kingdoms of life that were never meant to merge. There's no fear anymore. The forest is old, patient, and very good at survival. If it's figured out how to create hybrid organisms that can persist through changing climates and environmental stress, then maybe becoming part of that system isn't contamination. Maybe it's the future. Maybe just early to the transformation that's coming for others. Days are spent now standing in sunlight, growing slowly greener, needing less, feeling more connected to the vast network of life that flows beneath the soil. The Forest Service thinks they quarantine the valley, but the valley's influence spreads through root networks and spores and the seeds of hybrid plants that birds carry miles away. The transformation is slow, patient, inevitable. The forest has learned something new, and it's sharing that knowledge through the oldest network on Earth, the one that connects every tree, every plant, every organism that's learning to bridge the gap between what we were and what we're becoming. What once was a wildlife biologist is now something else, something that doesn't have a proper classification yet. Conservation in action, preserved by the very ecosystem a lifetime was spent trying to protect. And there are others. We're growing slowly, one transformed organism at a time, becoming the bridge between the ancient world of plants and the short-lived urgency of animal life. The forest is patient. It can wait, and so can those of us who are changing, standing in the sun, growing greener, growing stronger, growing into whatever comes next. My name is Molly, and I'm 31 years old. Back in November 1998, I was working the third shift at a gas station on Route 52 in Kimball, West Virginia. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid my bills and let me take classes during the day at the community college in Bluefield. The station was one of those old-style places built in the 70s, with 2 pumps outside and a small store inside that sold cigarettes, lottery tickets, and whatever expired snacks the distributor could offload cheap. I worked alone from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week, and for the most part, it was boring. Truckers would stop for coffee and fuel, occasional locals picking up cigarettes or beer, and long stretches of nothing where I'd study behind the counter or watch the small black and white TV we kept by the register. November 14th, 1998, started like any other Saturday night shift. I clocked in at 11, relieving the evening clerk who was always in a hurry to leave. The weather was cold, temperature in the low 30s, with a wind coming down from the mountains that made the old building creak and groan. I made a fresh pot of coffee, restocked the candy bars that had sold during the day, and settled in behind the counter with my economics textbook. Route 52 at night was usually dead, maybe 10 customers in an 8-hour shift if I was lucky. The truck showed up around 12:20 a.m. I noticed it because it was an older model pickup, dark blue or black, hard to tell under the sodium lights of the parking lot. It pulled in, circled the pumps slowly like the driver was checking them out, then pulled back onto the highway without stopping. Weird, but not alarming. People changed their minds all the time, decided to go to a different station, or realized they had enough gas after all. 20 minutes later, the same truck came back. Same slow circle around the parking lot, same departure without stopping. I watched it more carefully this time, trying to see the driver, but the windows were tinted and the lighting was bad. The truck had West Virginia plates. That much I could see, but I couldn't make out the numbers. When it came back a third time at 1:15 a.m., I started feeling uneasy. The pattern was too deliberate. Circle the lot, slow down near the front windows, like someone was looking inside, then leave. I couldn't see the driver clearly, just a shape behind the wheel, but I could feel them watching. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, that animal instinct that tells you when you're being hunted. I picked up the phone and called the county sheriff's office. The dispatcher, a woman named Clara, who I'd talked to before on slow nights, took down the information. She said they'd send a deputy to check it out, but it might be 20 minutes or more since they were dealing with a domestic disturbance call on the other side of the county. She told me to keep the doors locked and call back if anything else happened. The truck returned at 1:35 a.m. This time it parked at the far edge of the lot, near the air pump that hadn't worked in years. Just sat there, engine running, headlights off. I could see the exhaust rising in the cold air, could see that shape behind the wheel, still and watching. My hands were shaking as I made sure the door was locked, as I checked that the panic button under the counter was working. The station had been robbed twice in the 3 years before I started working there, and they'd installed a silent alarm that connected directly to the sheriff's office. I called again. Clara said the deputy was on his way, should be there in 10 minutes. She stayed on the line with me, talking to keep me calm, asking about school, about my plans after graduation. But I couldn't focus on the conversation. All I could see was that truck sitting there in the darkness, that shape behind the wheel, patient and still. At 1:50 a.m. the truck pulled away again, just drove off like nothing had happened, heading south on Route 52. I felt a wave of relief so strong my knees went weak. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe just someone killing time, or lost, or having car trouble and trying to decide if they needed help. But I didn't believe that. Something about the deliberate circling, the watching, felt predatory. The deputy showed up at 2 a.m. Young guy couldn't have been more than 25, with a name tag that read Miller. He walked the perimeter of the station, checked the bathrooms, looked at the security camera footage from the parking lot. The cameras were old, and the tape quality was terrible, but you could see the truck circling, see it parked and watching. Miller wrote down what he could see of the license plate, said he'd run it when he got back to his car, and told me to keep calling if it came back. It came back at 2:20 a.m. Same truck, same slow approach, but this time it pulled right up to the front doors. Just sat there, maybe 15 feet away, the engine idling. I hit the panic button and grabbed the tire iron we kept under the counter for protection. Miller had left 10 minutes earlier. I was alone again. The driver's door opened. A figure got out, and in the harsh light from the station windows, I finally got a good look. Tall, wearing dark clothing, and what looked like a work uniform. As the figure came closer, I could see more details. It was the evening shift clerk's jacket. The same brown uniform jacket with the station logo on the breast pocket. But the evening clerk was a guy named Tommy, who was about 5'6" and skinny. This person was much bigger, broader. They walked up to the doors and tried the handle. When it didn't open, they knocked. Not aggressive pounding, just casual knocking, like a customer wanting service. I stood there behind the counter, tire iron in my hand, phone in the other, and said nothing. Just watched. The figure stepped back so I could see them better in the light. They were wearing Tommy's. Complete uniform, jacket, shirt, even the name tag. But the face was wrong. Older, harder, with eyes that didn't blink enough and a smile that looked practiced and fake. They knocked again, then spoke, voice muffled through the glass but audible. Evening shift. Need to pick up something I forgot. My voice came out steadier than I felt. We're closed. Come back during day shift. The smile got wider. Just let me in for a minute. I left my wallet in the back room. No, you need to leave or I'm calling the police again. The figure's expression changed then. The fake smile dropped away, and what was underneath was cold and hungry. They tried the door again, harder this time, rattling it in its frame. Then they walked back to the truck, and I thought they were leaving. Instead, they opened the passenger door and pulled something out. A tire iron, bigger than the one I was holding. They came back to the door and started hitting it. The glass was reinforced, thank God, the kind they install in gas stations specifically to prevent break-ins. It cracked but didn't shatter. I was on the phone with dispatch again, screaming that someone was trying to break in, that I needed help now. Clara was talking fast, saying deputies were en route, just 3 minutes away, hold on. The figure hit the door 5, 6, 7 times. The glass was spiderwebbing, bulging inward with each impact. They were going to get through. I backed away from the counter, tire iron raised, preparing for what was coming. In my head, I was running through everything I'd learned in the self-defense class I'd taken in college. Go for the eyes, the throat, the knees. Make noise. Fight like hell. Then I heard sirens. The figure heard them too, stopped mid-swing, and looked toward the highway. 2 sheriff's cars were coming fast, lights flashing. The figure dropped the tire iron, ran to the truck and peeled out of the parking lot, heading north, the opposite direction from the approaching deputies. Miller was the first one through the door, gun drawn, checking to make sure I was okay. Another deputy went after the truck, but it had too much of a head start and disappeared into the network of mountain roads that branch off Route 52. They put out an APB, called in the plate number Miller had gotten earlier, and took my statement while I sat in the back office shaking and drinking terrible coffee. The next day, they found the truck abandoned in a parking lot in Welch, about 15 miles away. The evening clerk, Tommy, was in the truck bed. He'd been dead for hours, killed sometime before his shift ended. He'd been scheduled to work until 11 p.m. but never made it home. Someone had attacked him, taken his uniform, and then come to the station wearing it. The deputies figured the attacker had been scoping out the station during those earlier drive-bys, watching my routine, waiting for the right moment. They caught him 4 days later. A drifter with warrants in 3 states, history of violence, who'd been working odd jobs in the area for a few weeks. He'd killed Tommy during an attempted robbery, taken the uniform thinking he could use it to get into the station after hours, find the safe, or the register money. He didn't expect me to refuse him entry, didn't expect me to have a panic button, didn't expect the deputies to respond so fast. I quit the gas station job the next week. Couldn't go back to that place. Couldn't work nights anymore without jumping at every sound, every customer who looked wrong. I finished my degree during day classes and found work at a bank where I'm surrounded by people during business hours and never have to be alone in a building at night. But I still think about that night sometimes, about how close it was, about Tommy, who was just trying to make a living and got killed for his uniform jacket, about standing there with a tire iron, knowing I was about to have to fight for my life, and about the strange clarity that came with that knowledge. I'd always wondered if I'd freeze in a real emergency, if I'd be able to defend myself when it mattered. I got my answer that night on Route 52, and I'm grateful I never had to fully test it. My name is Prince, and I'm 38 years old. I'm a traveling minister, non-denominational, spending most of my time moving between small communities in the Appalachian region where churches can't afford full-time pastors. I fill in for a Sunday here, a revival week there, baptisms and funerals and weddings wherever I'm needed. It's a calling I've followed for 12 years now, ever since I left a comfortable position at a megachurch in Charlotte to do what I felt God was actually asking me to do. I've preached in everything from modern worship centers to tiny country churches that still use hymnals from the 1950s, but nothing in those 12 years prepared me for what happened in November 2019 at a small church outside Helvetia, West Virginia, where I learned that sometimes the dead don't leave their posts, and sometimes finishing what they started is the only way to give them peace. The invitation came through a regional ministry coordinator in early November. A small congregation needed someone to lead their Sunday service on November 17th, 2019. Their regular circuit preacher had fallen ill, and they were desperate for someone to fill in. The pay wasn't much, but that's never been why I do this work. I agreed, got the directions, and drove out on Saturday the 16th to familiarize myself with the location and meet with whoever handled the church operations. The drive took me deep into the mountains, down roads that got progressively narrower and less maintained. The church sat in a valley, surrounded by forest, a white wooden building that looked like it had been there since the early 1900s. Simple construction, a small steeple with a bell, windows with original wavy glass. There were no other buildings nearby, no houses, no signs of the congregation that supposedly met there. Just the church, standing alone in a clearing, with graves scattered in an overgrown cemetery behind it. I parked and walked up to the front doors. They were unlocked, which surprised me. Most churches in isolated areas keep their doors locked when services aren't in session, too much risk of vandalism or theft. But these opened easily, the hinges creaking, and I stepped inside. The interior was immaculate, pews polished and arranged in neat rows, hymnals placed precisely in their holders, candles ready on the altar, everything clean and maintained despite the church's apparent isolation. The air smelled of lemon polish and old wood, with an underlying scent of candle wax. Afternoon light came through the windows in dusty beams, illuminating a simple cross on the wall behind the pulpit. I walked down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing in the empty space, and noticed something odd. There were papers on each pew, programs for a service. I picked one up and felt my skin prickle. The date on the program was November 17th, 1972, 47 years ago, exactly. The service outlined was a normal Sunday worship. Opening hymn, prayer, sermon, communion, closing hymn. But someone had drawn a heavy black line through the middle of the program, right between the sermon and communion sections. I spent an hour in that church, looking around, trying to understand what I'd walked into. In the small office behind the sanctuary, I found more records, attendance logs, financial records, all meticulously maintained through November 10th, 1972, then nothing, no entries after that date. The last notation in the attendance log listed 43 congregants present, including the pastor. I should have left then, should have called the ministry coordinator and told them I couldn't do this service, that something was wrong with this church and this situation. But I'm stubborn, and I believe that God puts me where I'm needed. So I spent Saturday night in my car in the church parking lot, doors locked, dozing uncomfortably, waiting for Sunday morning. Dawn came cold and gray. I went into the church around 8 a.m. to prepare, reviewing the notes I'd prepared for my sermon, setting up the communion elements, making sure everything was ready. The service was supposed to start at 10 a.m., and I expected maybe a handful of elderly congregants to show up, people who'd been coming to this church for decades and weren't about to stop now. At 9:45, they started arriving. Not in cars. I would have heard engines on those quiet mountain roads. They just appeared, walking out of the forest in groups of 2 and 3, all dressed in clothing from another era. The women wore long dresses and carried Bibles with worn leather covers. The men wore suits that looked hand-tailored, styles from the early 70s. They filed into the church silently, taking seats in the pews with practiced familiarity, each person sitting in what must have been their customary spot. I stood at the pulpit, watching them enter, my mouth dry and my heart pounding. They looked solid, real, not transparent, or glowing, or any of the things movies show you ghosts should look like. But there was something wrong with them. Something in the way they moved in perfect synchronization, the way none of them looked directly at me, the way the temperature dropped 10 degrees when they entered the sanctuary. By 10 a.m., every pew was occupied. I counted 43 people, exactly the number listed in that final attendance log from 1972. They sat with their hands folded, their faces calm and expectant, waiting for the service to begin. At the back of the church, standing near the door, was an older man in ministerial robes. He nodded to me once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both greeting and instruction. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what was happening, to demand an explanation. But before I could, the congregation began to sing. No one announced the hymn number. No one distributed hymnals. They just began, all 43 voices joining in perfect harmony, singing a hymn in a style and arrangement I'd never heard before. The sound was beautiful and terrible. Voices that shouldn't exist filling that church with a song that had been interrupted 47 years ago. I looked down at my notes, at the sermon I'd prepared, and I understood. They didn't need my sermon. They didn't need my modern interpretations or contemporary applications. They needed to finish what had been interrupted in 1972. I picked up one of those old programs from the pew and followed along, doing what the schedule said to do. After the opening hymn, I led them in prayer. The words came naturally, falling into patterns and phrasings that were more formal than my usual style, more traditional. The congregation responded at the appropriate moments, their voices unified, speaking as one entity rather than separate individuals. The sermon topic was listed with a scripture reference. I'd never prepared a sermon on that passage, but as I stood at that pulpit, looking out at those 43 expectant faces, the words came. I spoke about faith as substance, about hope deferred, about the patience required to trust in things unseen, about waiting and enduring and believing even when decades pass and nothing seems to change. The congregation listened with absolute attention, and I realized I wasn't really preaching to them. I was preaching for them, giving voice to the sermon their pastor never got to finish 47 years ago. After the sermon came communion. I consecrated the bread and wine, speaking the traditional words of institution, and they came forward in orderly rows. Each person knelt at the altar rail, and I served them elements they couldn't eat and wine they couldn't drink, but the ritual mattered. The completion mattered. One by one they received communion, their lips moving in silent prayer, their faces showing something that might have been relief or gratitude or simply recognition that this moment had finally come. The closing hymn began with them standing, their voices stronger now, more confident. The older man in ministerial robes joined in from the back of the church, his voice carrying over and through the congregation. When the final verse ended, when the last note faded into the rafters, they began to fade too. Not dramatically, not with any supernatural light show, just a gradual dissolution, like morning mist burning off in sunlight. Within minutes, the church was empty. Just me standing at the pulpit, breathing hard, my hands shaking. The communion elements were gone. The programs had vanished from the pews. The only evidence that anything had happened was the profound silence and the lingering scent of candle wax and old hymnal pages. I searched the local historical society later that week, found records of a fire at that church on November 17th, 1972. It happened during Sunday service, something to do with faulty wiring in the walls. The congregation was trapped inside, the doors jammed by heat-warped wood. 43 people died, including their pastor. They'd been in the middle of the service, somewhere between the sermon and communion when the fire started. For 47 years, they'd been waiting for someone to come and finish what had been interrupted, to complete the service that death had stolen from them. And somehow, through channels I'll never understand, I'd been called to do exactly that. I drove away from that valley knowing I'd been part of something beyond my theology training, beyond my understanding of how the world works. The church still stands there, I suppose, still waiting in that clearing, but it's empty now, truly empty, released from whatever had kept it frozen in November 1972. Sometimes my calling takes me to places where the ministry needed isn't for the living, where the service required is completion, closure, the finishing of rituals interrupted by tragedy. I don't advertise this experience, don't talk about it in my monthly newsletters, or mention it when I'm interviewed for new positions. But I remember those 43 voices singing in perfect harmony. Remember serving communion to people who'd been waiting nearly half a century for that moment. And I understand that faith sometimes means showing up to finish what others started, even when those others are long gone, and the congregation exists in a space between what was and what should have been. The ministry coordinator never called me about that service, never followed up to ask how it went. When I tried to reach him later, the number was disconnected, and I couldn't find any record of him in the regional directory. Maybe he was part of it too. Another piece of whatever mechanism exists to match the living with the needs of the dead. I don't know. What I know is that I was there, I finished that service, and somewhere in the records of the universe, November 17th, 2019 marks the day that 43 souls finally completed their Sunday worship and moved on to whatever comes after. My name is Remy, and I'm 44 years old. I work as a geodetic surveyor, which means I measure and map the Earth's surface with extreme precision. I've been doing this for 20 years, working mostly for government agencies and research institutions that need accurate elevation data, topographical maps, and geological surveys. It's technical work that requires patience and precision, using equipment that can measure distances and elevations down to the millimeter. I've surveyed everything from construction sites to national parks, and I thought I understood the shape of the land I was measuring. Then November 2012 happened, and I learned that geometry isn't always consistent, that space doesn't always follow the rules we think it does, and that some landscapes exist in dimensions our minds weren't built to comprehend. The assignment came from the U.S. Geological Survey in early November 2012. They needed updated elevation data for a section of Spruce Knob in West Virginia, the highest point in the state at 4,863 feet. The area was scheduled for some trail improvements, and they wanted current topographical data before any work began. It was a straightforward job, the kind I'd done hundreds of times before. I'd spend 3 or 4 days on the mountain, taking readings with my GPS equipment and theodolite, creating a detailed elevation map of the survey area. The weather forecast was decent for November, and I had all the permits I needed. I arrived at Spruce Knob on November 12, 2012, and started my survey work that afternoon. The mountain was beautiful in that stark, late autumn way, most of the leaves gone, the ground covered in a thin layer of frost that crunched under my boots. I set up my base station at a known benchmark, calibrated all my equipment, and began taking readings. The work was methodical, moving from point to point, recording coordinates and elevations, building up a detailed picture of the landscape. The first anomaly appeared around 3 p.m. I was taking readings on what should have been a gentle slope, maybe a 5-degree incline based on the existing maps, but my equipment was showing something impossible. According to the GPS data, I was standing on level ground. According to the theodolite, which measures angles, I was on a 20-degree slope. According to my own eyes and the level in my hand, the ground was definitely sloping. 3 different measurements, 3 different results, all from calibrated equipment that had been working perfectly an hour earlier. I recalibrated everything, assuming equipment malfunction, checked the batteries, verified the satellite connections, ran diagnostic tests. Everything checked out. The equipment was functioning normally, but the readings still didn't match. I moved to a different location and took new measurements. Same problem. The GPS coordinates showed me in one position. The elevation data showed me at a different height than the GPS indicated I should be, and the angular measurements suggested a terrain geometry that was incompatible with both. By the time the sun started setting, I had 2 hours of data that made no sense. I hiked back to my truck, uploaded the day's readings to my laptop, and tried to make sense of them. When I plotted the coordinates and elevations on a map, they created a topology that was geometrically impossible. The elevation changes didn't match the distances. The angles didn't add up correctly. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces were all from different boxes. I called my supervisor that evening, explained the situation. He suggested that maybe there was unusual magnetic interference affecting the equipment, or that the GPS satellites were experiencing some kind of atmospheric distortion. He told me to try again the next day, take multiple redundant measurements, and see if the data stabilized. November 13th brought the same problems, but worse. I spent 8 hours taking measurements, using 3 different GPS units and 2 different theodolites, all calibrated and cross-checked. The data was consistent in its impossibility. There was an area, roughly circular, about half a mile in diameter, where the normal rules of geometry seemed to break down. Inside this area, distances and elevations and angles refused to correlate in ways that made mathematical sense. And then there was the feeling. The closer I got to the center of the anomalous zone, the more wrong everything felt. Not wrong like being watched or threatened, but wrong like the space itself was incorrect. My depth perception would suddenly fail, making me misjudge distances. I'd take a step expecting level ground and find my foot landing 6 inches higher or lower than it should. The horizon line looked tilted even when my level showed it was perfectly straight. On November 14th, I reached what appeared to be the center of the anomaly. There was nothing visually unusual about the location, just forest, rocks, the same Appalachian landscape as everywhere else on the mountain. But my instruments went haywire. The GPS couldn't establish a stable position, the readings jumping around by hundreds of feet, even though I wasn't moving. The theodolite's level bubble behaved like it was in zero gravity, floating in the center of its chamber, instead of responding to the actual orientation of the instrument. I set up a reference grid, using traditional surveying methods that didn't rely on electronics. Stakes and string and a plumb bob, the kind of techniques surveyors used 100 years ago. But even these simple tools behaved strangely. The plumb bob didn't hang straight down. It angled off to one side, as if gravity itself was tilted in this location. The strings I'd stretched between stakes, which should have formed straight lines, appeared to curve when I sighted along them. that's when I saw it. Or rather, that's when my mind tried to process what my eyes were seeing and failed. There was a structure in that. Space, something massive and geometric, but my eyes couldn't quite focus on it. It existed in angles that didn't make sense, surfaces that curved in directions that weren't up or down or left or right, but some other direction that I couldn't name. Looking at it made my head hurt, made my eyes water, made me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, even though I knew the ground was solid beneath my feet. I tried to photograph it, but the camera couldn't capture it either. The images showed only trees and rocks, normal forest, but when I looked at those photos later, there was something wrong with them. The shadows fell in impossible directions. The trees in the background appeared to be both closer and farther away than the trees in the foreground. The perspective was broken in ways that made no visual sense. I spent 6 hours in that zone, taking measurements, trying to document what I was experiencing. My field notebook filled with numbers that contradicted each other, sketches that showed geometry that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. I measured distances that were longer going one direction than returning the same path. I recorded elevations that were higher at point B than point A, but also higher at point A than point B, which should have been impossible but was what my instruments consistently showed. As the afternoon wore on, I started experiencing other symptoms. Time felt wrong, elastic, like some minutes passed in seconds while others stretched into hours. My watch showed 3:47 p.m. for what felt like half an hour before suddenly jumping to 5:23 p.m. I'd look at my GPS and see coordinates that placed me miles away from where I knew I was standing. The satellite display showed 14 satellites in view, then 3, then 21, numbers that fluctuated wildly despite the clear sky. The worst part was what happened to my perception. The longer I stayed in that zone, the more I could see of the structure, the thing that existed in wrong angles and impossible dimensions. It was vast, I realized. What I'd been seeing was just a tiny portion of something much larger, something that extended through space, or through spaces, in ways that my three-dimensional thinking couldn't encompass. It was like being an ant crawling on a beach ball, able to perceive only the tiny curved surface beneath you while remaining completely unaware of the ball's full three-dimensional form. Except this wasn't a simple shape. This was something complex, mathematical, purposeful. I left the zone at sunset, hiking out faster than was probably safe, needing to get away from that wrongness. When I checked my equipment back at the truck, 16 hours of memory had been recorded, but I'd only been in the field for 8 hours, according to my watch and the position of the sun. The data files contained measurements I didn't remember taking, coordinates for locations I didn't remember visiting, elevation readings that described terrain geometry that couldn't physically exist. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see those impossible angles, those surfaces that curved through dimensions I couldn't name. And worse, I could understand them now, at least partially. My brain had started processing the geometry, started making sense of the mathematical relationships, and what I understood terrified me more than what I didn't. The structure wasn't natural. It was built, designed, constructed with purpose by something that understood mathematics and geometry in ways that humans don't. And it was functional. Those impossible angles weren't just shapes. They were doing something, some kind of function or process that required dimensional manipulation. I was seeing the physical manifestation of calculations that my species hasn't discovered yet and might never discover, because our minds aren't structured to think in those directions. I finished the survey on November 15th, working only in the areas outside the anomalous zone. I filed my report with the USGS, included all the contradictory data, wrote a detailed description of the geometric impossibilities I'd encountered. I expected skepticism, maybe concern about equipment malfunction or my mental state. Instead, 2 days later, I received a visit from people who wouldn't identify their agency. They took all my data, all my equipment, my field notebooks, even my personal journal. They made it clear that I was to discuss my findings with no one, that the area was now closed for environmental study, and that any attempt to return to Spruce Knob would result in serious legal consequences. They also made it clear, without quite saying it directly, that other surveyors had encountered similar anomalies in various locations, that this wasn't unique, and that there were people whose job was to monitor and contain knowledge of these places. That was 12 years ago. I still work as a surveyor, still take precise measurements, and create accurate maps. But I'm different now. I can perceive things that I couldn't before, see patterns in geometry that shouldn't be visible, understand spatial relationships that violate the rules of Euclidean space. It's like that exposure permanently altered something in my brain, opened some channel of perception that's supposed to stay closed in human minds. Sometimes I see those wrong angles in normal places. A building corner that exists in 4 dimensions instead of 3. A shadow that falls in a direction that light doesn't travel. A distance that measures differently depending on which direction you're traveling. They're subtle, easy to miss if you're not looking, but they're there. The normal world is full of tiny geometric inconsistencies, little tears in the fabric of space where something else shows through. I've stopped trying to measure them, stopped trying to document or understand them, because the more you understand about the true shape of space, the more you realize how fragile our normal perception is, how much of what we think is solid reality is just a convenient illusion our brains construct to keep us sane. The real geometry of the universe is vast and strange and utterly incompatible with human consciousness. We survive by not seeing it, by filtering out the impossible angles and contradictory dimensions. But I can't unsee what I saw on Spruce Knob. I can't understand the mathematics I glimpsed. My mind has been permanently changed by exposure to geometry that humans aren't meant to perceive. I function normally most of the time, do my job, interact with people, live a relatively ordinary life. But there's always a part of my awareness that's perceiving those other dimensions, seeing the cracks in reality, understanding that the world is shaped very differently than our senses tell us. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going insane, if the contradictory perceptions and impossible geometry are just elaborate delusions. But then I'll take a measurement and get readings that don't make sense, or see a shadow falling in a direction that violates the position of the sun, and I know it's real. The world contains spaces that don't follow our rules, structures built by intelligences that understand dimensions we haven't discovered. And once you've seen them, once your mind has learned to process that information, you can never go back to the comfortable ignorance of thinking reality is simple and consistent. I measure the Earth's surface for a living, but now I know that the surface I'm measuring extends into spaces I can't fully perceive, curves through dimensions that mathematics can describe but human intuition can't grasp. The land we walk on is more complex than we imagine, and sometimes, in certain places, the full complexity becomes briefly visible to minds that aren't equipped to handle it. I was unlucky enough to be in one of those places, and lucky enough to walk away still mostly sane. But I'll never be entirely human again. Not in the way I was before I tried to survey geometry that exists in directions humanity can't see. My name is Sean, and I'm 35 years old. I work as a commercial real estate appraiser, which means I evaluate properties for banks, investors, and developers who need to know what a building is worth before they buy or sell it. I've appraised everything from strip malls to office buildings to abandoned industrial sites. It's not exciting work, but it's steady and it pays well. Most of the time, I'm just taking measurements, checking structural integrity, comparing the property to recent sales of similar buildings in the area. But in November 2006, I was sent to appraise an abandoned psychiatric hospital in Grundy, Virginia. And what I found there changed my understanding of what buildings can contain, what institutions can trap within their walls, and what happens when the dead refuse to accept that their work is finished. The assignment came through my office on November 8, 2006. A development company was considering purchasing the old Grundy State Hospital, which had been closed since 1989, with plans to either renovate it or tear it down and build something new. They needed an appraisal to determine the property's value. The building had been empty for 17 years, and I expected the usual problems with abandoned structures: water damage, vandalism, structural deterioration, all the things that happen when a building sits unoccupied for nearly 2 decades. I drove out to Grundy on November 10th, arriving around 1 p.m. The hospital was a massive brick structure, 4 stories tall, built in the 1920s in that institutional style that prioritized function over aesthetics. It sat on a hill overlooking what was left of the town, surrounded by overgrown grounds that had once been manicured lawns. The main entrance was boarded up, but the development company had given me keys and permission to access the building through a side door that they'd had unsealed for inspection purposes. The first floor was what I expected: administrative offices with filing cabinets tipped over and papers scattered across water-stained floors. A reception area with a desk still in place, covered in dust and bird droppings from pigeons that had found their way inside through broken windows. A cafeteria with ancient appliances and tables bolted to the floor. Everything showed the decay of 17 years of abandonment: mold on the walls, ceiling tiles hanging down, that smell of rot and mildew that fills empty buildings. I took my photographs, made my notes about the structural damage, measured room dimensions, all the standard appraisal work. The building was in rough shape, but not beyond salvation if someone wanted to invest in serious renovation. I moved to the second floor, climbing stairs where the rubber treads had come loose and were curling up at the edges. The second floor was patient rooms, long corridors with doors on either side, each opening into a small room that had once held a bed, a small dresser, maybe a chair. Most of the furniture was gone, removed when the hospital closed, or stolen by scavengers in the years since. But some rooms still had items in them: a rusted bed frame, a broken lamp, tattered curtains hanging in windows. I walked the corridors, taking notes, and that's when I noticed something odd. One wing of the second floor had no dust. In an abandoned building, everything accumulates dust. It's unavoidable. But this wing, this entire corridor of maybe 15 rooms, was clean. Not spotless, but noticeably less dusty than the rest of the building. The floors showed wear patterns, like people had been walking through recently. The doors, instead of hanging crooked on damaged hinges like most doors in the building, all closed properly and latched when I tested them. I walked down that corridor slowly, my footsteps echoing on the old linoleum, and I could smell something that didn't belong in an abandoned building. Antiseptic. That sharp, chemical smell of industrial cleaner, faint but definitely present. And underneath it, something else. Coffee brewing maybe, or food cooking smells that suggested recent human activity. The third floor was where everything became impossible to rationalize. I reached the top of the stairs and stepped into a corridor that looked maintained. The lights were off, but I could see well enough from my flashlight and the afternoon sun coming through windows. This floor wasn't just clean, it was organized. Patient belongings were still in the rooms, arranged neatly on dressers and windowsills. Beds were made with blankets tucked in with hospital corners. Calendars hung on walls, and when I looked closer at one, I felt my skin crawl. The calendar showed November 2006. This month. This year. Someone had been updating these calendars. I heard footsteps then. Not the creaking of an old building settling, but actual footsteps measured and purposeful, coming from further down the corridor. I called out, identifying myself, explaining I was there to appraise the building. No response, just those footsteps getting closer. A figure emerged from one of the patient rooms, a woman wearing a nurse's uniform, the old-fashioned kind with the white dress and cap that nurses stopped wearing decades ago. She carried a clipboard and walked with the brisk efficiency of someone on rounds. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence at all, just moved from door to door, checking each room, making notes on her clipboard. I stood frozen, my rational mind trying to process what I was seeing. The woman looked solid, real, not transparent or glowing, but her uniform was spotless white, impossibly clean for an abandoned building, and she moved with a quality that was just slightly wrong, like a film playing back at the wrong speed. More figures appeared. Orderlies in white uniforms pushing carts with medication. A doctor in a long white coat, stethoscope around his neck, moving from room to room. They went about their routines with complete focus, checking on patients I couldn't see, administering treatments to empty beds, maintaining a hospital that had been closed for 17 years. I backed toward the stairs, my camera forgotten, my appraisal notes meaningless. But before I could leave, one of the figures looked directly at me. The doctor, standing in a doorway, his eyes focusing on me for the first time. He gestured for me to follow him, a simple motion that somehow carried authority and urgency. Against every instinct telling me to run, I followed. He led me down the corridor to a room at the end. Inside was a bed with the sheets turned down, a patient gown laid out, a chart hung on the wall with my name on it. My name, written in careful handwriting, along with an admission date of November 10th, 2006. Today's date. The doctor gestured to the bed, then to the gown, his meaning clear. He wanted me to put on the gown, to get into the bed, to become a patient in this phantom hospital. Other figures had gathered in the doorway behind him. Nurses, orderlies, all watching me with patient expectation, ready to begin whatever treatment protocol they had planned. I ran, pushed past them, or through them, I'm not sure which, and ran for the stairs. They didn't chase me, but I could hear them behind me, following at that same measured, purposeful pace. The hospital staff doing their jobs, maintaining their routines, refusing to accept that the hospital had closed, that their patients were long gone, that they themselves were dead. I made it to the first floor and out the side door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key to lock it behind me. I got in my car and drove away, not stopping until I was back in town, surrounded by people and noise and the normal world. I filed my appraisal report the next day, marked the building as structurally unsound, recommended demolition rather than renovation, cited extensive damage and contamination that made the property essentially worthless. My supervisor questioned some of my findings. The photographs I'd taken showed typical abandonment decay, nothing that would warrant such a harsh assessment. But I stood by my report, and the development company decided to pass on the purchase. The hospital was demolished in early 2007. I drove by the site once during the demolition and talked to some of the crew. They mentioned odd things, equipment malfunctions, workers refusing to go into certain areas, the sense that the building didn't want to come down, but they finished the job, reduced it to rubble, and eventually something else was built on that hilltop. I've thought about that day often over the past 18 years, about those figures in vintage uniforms, going through the motions of caring for patients who weren't there, about the chart with my name on it, the bed prepared for me, the gown laid out ready. They wanted to admit me, to make me part of whatever phantom routine they were maintaining. I wonder what would have happened if I'd put on that gown, if I'd gotten into that bed. Would I have become part of it too, trapped in 2006 forever, another ghost maintaining the eternal operation of a hospital that refused to close? I still do real estate appraisals, still visit abandoned buildings and assess their value, but I'm more careful now about which assignments I accept. I research the properties beforehand, learn their histories, pay attention to warning signs. And if I walk into a building that's too clean, that smells of antiseptic and coffee when it should smell of rot and decay, I leave immediately. Some buildings don't want to be empty. Some institutions are so strong, so ingrained with purpose and routine, that they continue operating long after they should have stopped. The staff keeps working, the patients keep being treated, and anyone who wanders into that space risks being incorporated into the routine, assigned a bed and a chart and a place in a system that no longer exists anywhere but in the building itself. I don't know if those figures were ghosts or something else, some kind of temporal echo or psychic residue left by decades of institutional routine. I don't know if they knew they were dead, or if they were so locked into their roles that the question never occurred to them. What I know is that I was almost admitted to a hospital that had been closed for 17 years, and if those demolition crews hadn't torn it down, the staff would still be there, making rounds, checking charts, waiting for the next patient to walk through their doors and give them someone new to care for in their eternal, impossible hospital. My name is Elena, and I'm 29 years old. I work as a botanical researcher specializing in invasive species management. Most of my work involves documenting non-native plants that threaten local ecosystems, studying their spread patterns, and helping land management agencies develop control strategies. It's detailed patient work that requires careful observation and meticulous record-keeping. I've spent the last 5 years working in the Appalachian region, tracking everything from Japanese knotweed to tree of heaven. In November 2023, I was assigned to investigate an unusual fungal growth in Pipestem State Park in West Virginia, and what I found there has left me questioning whether my memories are real, whether my research has any validity, and whether I'm still the same person who entered that gorge 3 weeks ago. The assignment came from the State Park Service on November 3, 2023. Rangers had reported an unusual fungal growth affecting native vegetation in one of the park's remote gorges. They described it as spreading rapidly and displaying bioluminescent properties at night, which was unusual enough to warrant investigation. I drove out to Pipestem on November 5th, met with the park superintendent, and hiked into the affected area that afternoon. The gorge was beautiful in that late autumn way, most leaves fallen, the forest floor covered in a carpet of brown and gold. The fungal growth was immediately visible once I reached the reported location. It appeared as a web-like network of pale filaments spreading across the forest floor, climbing up tree trunks, connecting plants in an intricate pattern that looked almost deliberately designed. The growth was concentrated around a small stream that ran through the bottom of the gorge, spreading outward in roughly circular patterns from the water source. I spent that first day taking samples, photographing the growth patterns, documenting which plant species were affected. The fungus seemed to prefer hardwoods, oak, maple, hickory, but also infected understory plants like rhododendron and mountain laurel. What struck me immediately was how healthy the infected plants looked. Usually, fungal infections cause visible damage, discoloration, wilting, tissue death. But these plants appeared vibrant, perhaps even more vigorous than uninfected specimens nearby. I returned that evening to observe the bioluminescence the rangers had reported. As darkness fell, the fungal networks began to glow with a soft blue-green light, creating patterns across the forest floor that looked like constellations or circuit boards. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, unlike any bioluminescence I'd seen in my professional work. I took photographs, video recordings, detailed notes about the light intensity and patterns. That's when I noticed something odd about my field notes. I'd written observations about the fungus that I didn't remember making, detailed descriptions of growth rates and chemical compositions that I couldn't have determined without laboratory analysis. But there they were, in my handwriting, in my notebook, observations I had no memory of recording. I spent November 6th and 7th collecting more samples and documenting the spread. The fungus was growing faster than any species I'd encountered, expanding its coverage by several feet each day. And my notes kept containing information I didn't remember writing. Observations about spore dispersal mechanisms, hypotheses about the fungus's evolutionary origins, detailed sketches of cellular structures I hadn't examined under a microscope. On November 8th, I brought portable lab equipment into the gorge to analyze samples on site. The fungus showed unusual cellular characteristics, structures that didn't quite match known fungal taxonomy, chemical compounds I couldn't identify with my field testing kit. But what disturbed me more was the realization that I'd been spending more time in the gorge than I'd intended. I'd arrive, planning to work for 4 hours, and suddenly realize 6 or 7 hours had passed, with no clear memory of that time. The bioluminescence became more intense each night. By November 10th, the entire affected area glowed brightly enough to read by, those blue-green patterns pulsing in rhythms that seemed almost communicative. I found myself staring at the patterns for long periods, losing track of time, feeling a strange sense of connection to the fungal network. My research notes from this period are extensive, but increasingly strange, filled with observations that blur the line between scientific documentation and something more subjective, more experiential. November 12th was when I noticed the physical changes. My skin, when I examined it closely in my motel bathroom, had a faint greenish tint, barely visible, but definitely there, especially on my hands and arms where I'd had the most contact with the fungal specimens. I told myself it was just staining from the samples, that the bioluminescent compounds had temporarily discolored my skin. But the tint didn't wash off. I called my supervisor that day, tried to explain what I was observing, but when I reviewed my notes to give him specific details, I found inconsistencies. Events I clearly remembered happening on November 9th were dated November 11th in my notes. Photographs I was certain I'd taken on my first day in the gorge had metadata showing they were captured days later. My timeline had become unreliable, my memories no longer matching the documented evidence. On November 14th, I brought a colleague into the field with me. Noelle, another botanist I'd worked with on previous projects, drove down from her university position to assess the situation. I needed someone else to confirm what I was seeing, to verify that the fungus was real and my observations were valid. We spent the day in the gorge together, and she documented everything independently, took her own samples, made her own notes, photographed the bioluminescent displays that evening. But when we compared our observations later, they didn't match. Noelle described the fungus as interesting but not particularly unusual, a potentially new species, but showing typical fungal characteristics. Her photographs showed faint luminescence, nothing like the intense glow I'd been documenting. The samples she collected appeared normal under microscopic examination. Standard fungal structures, nothing anomalous. Either I was experiencing elaborate hallucinations, or the fungus was affecting my perception in ways that made me see things differently than they actually were. Or perhaps Noelle was the one perceiving it incorrectly, and my enhanced observations were somehow more accurate. I had no way to determine which interpretation was correct. I've been back in my apartment for a week now, supposedly recovering from what my supervisor called field exposure fatigue. But I know something changed in that gorge. My skin still has that faint green tint. I need less food than before, and I find myself drawn to windows, to sunlight, spending hours just standing in the light with a feeling of contentment I can't quite explain. My sleep patterns have changed. I sleep less, and when I do sleep, I dream of vast networks spreading through soil, of chemical communications between organisms, of perspectives that aren't quite human. The samples I brought back are in storage at my lab, but when I examine them now, they appear completely normal. Just typical fungal specimens, no bioluminescence, No unusual structures. My field notes remain, filled with observations and sketches, but I can no longer trust whether they document reality or delusion. The photographs on my camera show the glowing patterns, but digital files can be corrupted, metadata can be wrong. Noelle calls occasionally to check on me. She's concerned, thinks I experienced some kind of breakdown, perhaps from exposure to fungal toxins that caused temporary neurological effects. She might be right. That would be the rational explanation. But I remember that gorge. Remember the beauty of those glowing networks. Remember the sense of connection I felt to something vast and patient and utterly unlike human consciousness. The state park has closed the affected area for further study. Other researchers have examined the site, and their reports describe a moderately interesting fungal species, but nothing extraordinary. No bioluminescence, no rapid spread, no anomalous characteristics, just a fungus doing what fungi do, breaking down organic matter and recycling nutrients through the ecosystem. But I still have my memories, even if I can't trust them. I remember standing in that gorge surrounded by blue-green light, feeling my perceptions shift, understanding for brief moments how the fungus experienced the world. Not through sight or sound, but through chemical gradients and nutrient flows, through the slow, patient awareness of an organism that exists, primarily underground, that thinks in timescales of seasons rather than seconds. My skin is greener now, not dramatically but noticeably. I've started telling people it's a reaction to field chemicals, a temporary discoloration that will fade. But it's not fading. It's spreading slowly, and I find I don't particularly mind. I eat less and less, finding that an hour in direct sunlight leaves me feeling energized and satisfied in ways that food no longer does. My apartment is filled with plants now, and I spend time with my hands in their soil, feeling something through that contact that I can't quite name, but that feels right. I'm writing this account while I still can, while my thoughts still organize themselves in human patterns, and my memories still feel like they belong to me. But I'm changing, slowly but definitely changing, and I don't know if the person I'm becoming will care about documentation or scientific accuracy, or maintaining the distinction between observer and observed. The fungus is still in that gorge, still spreading its networks through the soil, still glowing with that beautiful light that maybe only I can see. Or maybe I never saw it at all, and everything I remember is just neural misfiring caused by exposure to mycotoxins. I have no way to know for certain. All I have are my unreliable memories, my contradictory notes, and the slow, steady greening of my skin as something that entered me in that gorge continues its patient work of transformation. I spend my evenings now standing by my window, facing the setting sun, my hands pressed against the glass, feeling energy flow into me through pathways that shouldn't exist in human physiology. And I wonder if understanding came at the cost of accuracy, if seeing the truth meant losing the ability to document it in ways that others would accept as valid. The fungus showed me something, taught me something, changed something fundamental in how I perceive and process reality. Whether that change is gift or curse, evolution or madness, I no longer have the perspective to judge. The samples remain in storage, my notes remain in my files, and I remain here, growing slowly greener, needing slowly less, becoming slowly something that isn't quite what I was when I first walked into that glowing gorge in November. The boundary between researcher and subject has dissolved, and I exist now in the space between, neither fully human nor fully other, questioning everything I remember and trusting nothing I observe, caught in the beautiful, terrible uncertainty of a mind that may have expanded beyond its original limits, or simply broken under the weight of something it was never meant to perceive. That's all 11 stories from the Appalachian Mountains this November. These accounts remind us that some places hold mysteries we may never fully understand, and some encounters change us in ways we can't reverse. Thank you for watching Bleak Fears. If these stories unsettled you, hit that like button and subscribe for more true horror. Share your own Appalachian experiences in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember, some mountains have been here far longer than we have.